Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, The Eyes That Watch Me Walk. I never thought my night shift at the bookstore would feel like the prelude to something wrong. The store was nestled in a quiet part of town, sandwiched between a shuttered cafe and a pawn shop with flickering neon. It wasn't the kind of place where anything out of the ordinary happened, but on that Tuesday, everything felt off. I closed the front door behind the last customer just before 8, locking the deadbolt twice out of habit. The street was already emptying as the evening grew colder, and the dim glow of the street lamps cast long, wavering shadows across the cracked pavement. I flipped the sign to closed and started the nightly routine, restocking shelves, wiping down tables, and running a slow inventory check on some of the older titles. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their hum filling the silence. Outside, the occasional car passed, but mostly it was just the city settling into its nighttime rhythm. About an hour in, while I was shelving a stack of hardcovers near the back, I heard the bell above the door jingle. I glanced up, expecting to see someone who had forgotten the closing time. But the glass was dark, reflecting the inside of the store like a mirror. No one. Strange. Maybe the wind had caught the doorframe just right. I shook it off and went back to work. A few minutes later, the bell jingled again. This time, I walked over slowly and peered outside. Still nothing. No one on the narrow sidewalk, no one crouched behind the neighboring storefront. The street lamp's yellow light flickered, bathing the walkway in a patchy glow. My heart picked up a little. I checked the door handle. It was locked tight. I moved back to the counter, unease creeping in like a chill from the concrete floor. The next time the bell jingled, I didn't even bother looking. It felt like a game, or a trick someone was playing from the other side to get me rattled. I pulled my phone out but saw there was no signal. Typical for this part of town, but tonight it felt worse. I returned to my spot near the registers and tried to focus on the paperwork I had to finish. But I kept catching movement in the glass, shadows that didn't belong, flashes at the edges of my vision. When I turned quickly, there was nothing but the empty street. Then came the tapping. Soft, deliberate. At first, I thought it was the rain against the window, but the forecast hadn't mentioned any showers. The sound was rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingertips on the glass pane just outside the entrance. I swallowed hard and crept closer. The street beyond was still deserted, but the tapping continued. It was slow and steady, almost patient, like a heartbeat. I pulled back, feeling my throat tighten. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just a coincidence anymore. I scanned the parking lot behind the store, empty. No vehicles, no figures. Just the shadowy outlines of trees and the dull glow of a distant billboard. Minutes passed, and the tapping stopped as suddenly as it began. The silence that followed was so heavy my ears seemed to ring. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that maybe a branch had scraped the window or some animal had wandered too close. I checked the locks again, double and triple, then retreated to the small office in the back. There, I could see the entire storefront through the security monitor's grainy black and white feed. The camera angle was wide, but for a moment, it seemed to catch a figure standing just beyond the reach of the street lamp's light. My breath hitched. I zoomed in with the controls, but the screen flickered, and the figure vanished. I blinked hard, leaning forward, but the feed was back to the empty street. I debated calling the police, but with no clear threat or evidence, and in a neighborhood known for petty mischief rather than serious crime, I worried they'd dismiss me. Still, my phone showed no service, and the landline was a dead line since the last storm 2 weeks ago. The store was my refuge, usually a place of quiet and calm. Tonight, it felt like a trap. I gathered my things to leave early, deciding to walk the block to the bus stop. Maybe getting out of the building would clear my head. As I unlocked the back door, the night air hit me cold and sharp. The alley was narrow and dimly lit, littered with scattered cigarette butts and empty cans. I heard a faint scraping sound from the far end, metal against concrete. I froze. My eyes darted toward the noise, but the alley was empty save for the flickering streetlight that buzzed overhead. The sound stopped. I started moving again, quickening my pace. At the bus stop, the bench was empty, but a crumpled flyer was stuck beneath it, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I picked it up. It was an advertisement for a local gym, nothing threatening, but my fingers lingered on the words. Just then, a shadow shifted behind the bus shelter. I spun around. No one. The street was silent again, the occasional car far off in the distance. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I looked back toward the bookstore. The windows were dark. No sign of the tapping or the figure. I waited for the bus, trying to steady my breathing. The minutes stretched, each one heavier than the last, until headlights finally appeared, slicing through the night. I climbed aboard and sank into the seat, pulling my coat tighter. As the bus pulled away, I glanced back toward the bookstore's faint glow in the distance. Somewhere, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, something was watching. Waiting. The sense of relief I felt was shallow, fragile, like the brief pause before a storm breaks. And I knew I wasn't safe, not yet. I had been living in that cramped studio apartment for just under 2 weeks when the unease started to creep in. The building was old, the kind with squeaky floorboards and drafty windows that rattled when the wind picked up, but it was affordable and close enough to my job to make commuting bearable. Nothing about the place suggested danger. At least, nothing at first. The first thing I noticed was the sound in the hallway. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable, a faint scraping noise, like nails dragging lightly across the linoleum floor outside my door. It was always late, around midnight or later, when I would be just about to fall asleep. The noises would start softly, almost hesitant, then stop abruptly. I told myself it was someone moving furniture or cleaning staff, or maybe even the old pipes creaking, but something about it made my skin crawl. One night, I stayed up to listen. I sat on the edge of my bed, the thin blanket clutched in my hands, and the hallway light spilled in under the crack of the door, dust motes swirling in the yellow glow. The scraping came again, slow and methodical, like something or someone was dragging a shoe along the floor. It moved from the end of the hall toward my door, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting for more, but the silence returned, heavier this time. The next day, I checked the peephole in my door. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The maintenance sign was still taped to the bulletin board, but the smell of fresh paint had long since faded. I tried to shake off the weirdness, chalking it up to old building noises or my imagination. Still, I double-checked the locks on my door before going to sleep. It was on Thursday night that I realized I wasn't just imagining things. I was home alone, my roommates out of town for the weekend. I had just finished dinner and was halfway through a show when I heard the faint scraping again. Except this time, it was accompanied by a low breathy sound, almost like a sigh. It came from the hallway, right outside my door. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sat frozen, staring at the door, the noise sharp and clear in the silence of the room. I wanted to call the police, but I thought, maybe it's a neighbor or a drunk person who made it inside somehow. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The sound stopped. I let out a shaky breath. Then there was a soft knock, 3 quick taps, deliberate. I froze again. It wasn't the kind of knock a neighbor would make, it sounded calculated, almost like a code. I didn't respond. I didn't move. Then a voice whispered, barely audible but chilling in its clarity, "Hey, I know you're in there." I scrambled to my phone, but it was dead. I must have forgotten to charge it. Panic clawed at me. I reached for the old rotary dial that I'd found in a box at a garage sale a few years back and kept on a shelf, mostly as a curiosity. It wasn't connected to anything. I was completely cut off. The whisper came again, this time a little louder, and it felt like it was right next to the door, breath warm against the wood. "Just open up. I won't hurt you." The rational part of my brain screamed that this was someone dangerous, but the voice had a strange calmness that unsettled me even more. Whoever it was, they knew I was alone. They had probably been watching me. The knocking continued in a slow, steady rhythm. I remembered the spare key I hid under a loose brick by the side of the building and debated running to grab it. But then I thought, if it's someone waiting out here, maybe they're watching the brick, too. I backed away from the door and crawled to my bedroom window. It overlooked a narrow alley and the parking lot where a few cars sat abandoned overnight. The street lamp outside flickered, casting long, jittery shadows on the cracked asphalt. I peered out, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was outside, but the alley was empty. No sign of a person. I waited a few minutes, heart pounding, ears straining for any other sound, but the hallway was silent. Relief washed over me, but I didn't lower my guard. I locked the deadbolt and slid the chain across. Then I pushed a heavy bookcase in front of the door, hoping it would buy me some time if whoever was out there had a key. The next morning, I was exhausted and jumpy, every noise in the apartment setting me on edge. I told my manager I needed to swap shifts so I could stay home and try to get some rest. But even during the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That afternoon, I went to the mailbox downstairs. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Amid the usual bills and junk mail was a small, unmarked envelope, no return address, no name. Inside was a single scrap of paper with a message scrawled in uneven, almost childish handwriting, "I'm close." I dropped the envelope and nearly ran back up the stairs, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. I locked my door behind me, wedged the bookcase in place again, and sat against the wall, trying to breathe evenly. I didn't know who was watching me or what they wanted, but now there was no doubt. The danger was real, and it was closing in. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and whisper outside made me flinch. I kept my phone plugged in, finger hovering over the emergency call button. I debated going to the police but feared they'd dismiss it as paranoia without concrete evidence. The hours dragged on, and just before dawn, I heard it again, the scraping, the breathy sigh, the deliberate taps on the door. Then a voice, clear and calm, whispered, "Don't be scared. I'm just outside." I locked my eyes on the door, willing it to hold. The sound stopped abruptly, then the hallway felt deathly silent, as if the person had vanished into thin air. For the first time since it started, I allowed myself a shaky breath. But I knew this was only the beginning. Whoever was out there wasn't going to stop, and I was running out of options. I had never thought much about the bus stop at the edge of town before that night. It was just a patch of cracked concrete with a bent metal bench, half covered by an old, stained shelter. The flickering streetlight overhead buzzed faintly, casting long, uneven shadows on the sidewalk. I'd arrived there around 11:15 p.m., waiting for the last bus back to my apartment from the late shift at the diner. The world was quieter than usual, the usual passing cars and distant murmurs of nightlife reduced to a whisper behind the trees edging the road. I was alone, or so I thought. At first, the only unusual thing was a man standing a few feet away, just beyond the shelter's pale yellow light. He was leaning against the lamppost, hands shoved deep in the pockets of a dark jacket, the collar turned up against a cool spring breeze. His face was mostly hidden in the shadows, but I caught the sharp outline of a nose and the glint of eyes that seemed to flicker when he noticed me looking. I shifted on the bench, pulling my coat tighter around me, trying to ignore the prickling feeling at the back of my neck. The bus was due in 10 minutes, but the man stayed where he was, silent, unmoving. I caught my breath when he took a step closer, stopping just at the edge of the light. For a moment, I considered standing up, moving away, but the bus stop was a small, isolated space, and my options felt limited. Besides, I told myself, there was nothing remotely threatening in the way he stood, no raised voice or sudden movement. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough like gravel grinding against glass. "You live alone?" The question hit me like a cold splash. I stared at him, uncertain whether to answer, but something in the tone, casual but too sharp, made the hairs on my arms rise. "Yeah," I said cautiously, keeping my gaze steady. "Why?" No response. Just a slow, deliberate step forward. I noticed then that his boots were scuffed, mud caked along the soles, and there was a faint, sour smell, wood earth and something metallic, like old rust mixed with sweat. "I've seen you around," he said after a pause, voice almost conversational again. "At the diner. Night shifts." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah. You're the one who closes up the place, right? Late nights, alone?" I felt my pulse quicken. "Yeah," I said again, more firmly this time. He smiled then, but it wasn't friendly. It was slow, deliberate, like he was tasting something unpleasant but enjoying it anyway. "That must be lonely." The wind picked up, rattling the shelter's thin metal roof, and I pulled my coat tighter around me. I glanced around, no one else nearby, no cars passing. My phone was in my pocket, but I hadn't dared check it. I didn't want to show how nervous I was. "I have to catch the bus," I said, trying to sound steady. He didn't move, just tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Where do you live?" "I could walk you." "No, thanks," I answered quickly, standing up. The bench scraped against the concrete, loud in the silence. He took a step back, then another, but stayed just within the glow of the streetlight. "Suit yourself," he said, voice flat. I swallowed my unease and walked to the edge of the stop, keeping my back to the road, eyes on the dark stretch of pavement ahead. The bus was late, and the minutes dragged by like hours. I kept glancing over my shoulder. The man remained where he was, watching me. When the bus finally came, its headlights cutting through the darkness, the man slipped away quietly into the shadows, vanishing before I could see where he was headed. I thought I was safe once I'd stepped onto the bus and the doors closed behind me. The interior was dimly lit, almost empty except for a few passengers scattered near the front. I found a seat near the middle, but even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. When I pulled out my phone to check the time, the screen illuminated the window beside me, revealing dark trees rushing past. That was when I noticed the reflection, a figure standing still on the side of the road. For a heart-stopping second, I thought it was the man from the bus stop, but when the bus passed, there was only a lone street sign and the empty shoulder. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a coincidence, but the dread in my stomach tightened like a fist. The bus ride was nerve-wracking, every stop a potential risk. I felt exposed, trapped inside a moving bubble with no way to escape if something went wrong. When the bus finally pulled up near my apartment, I was the only one to disembark. I hurried inside the building, the heavy door thudding shut behind me. The lobby was deserted, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in a monotonous drone. I fumbled with my keys, hands trembling slightly, and locked the door behind me. Upstairs, I could hear the muffled hum of a television from the apartment next to mine. I turned on every light as I passed through the hallway, the sudden brightness cutting through the lingering shadows. At home, I double-locked the door and slid the chain into place. I checked the windows, dragging the curtains closed even though it was late and the street was empty. Then, finally, I sat down on the couch, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself I'd just been overthinking it, that the man was probably harmless or just a loner who liked to talk to strangers. But the echo of his voice lingered in my mind, the way his eyes had flicked to mine like a predator sizing up prey. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak in the apartment sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to shift just beyond my field of vision. In the early morning hours, when the world outside was still and quiet, I heard a soft tapping at the window. I froze. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate. I didn't look. Instead, I pulled the curtains tighter and sat in the dark, waiting for dawn. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the gnawing feeling never left. I was driving home after my late shift at the hospital, the city's edges blurring into darkness as I moved farther out. The roads thinned, streetlights flickered past in uneven intervals, and the radio buzzed low with static between songs. It was a route I had taken hundreds of times, yet tonight something felt off. It began with that car behind me. At first, I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror, a pair of dull yellow beams following at a steady distance. Not too close, but persistent enough to make me glance repeatedly. I thought maybe it was just coincidence. The road was narrow, and cars tended to group in clusters after midnight, but this one hadn't passed when I took the turn off the main highway onto the smaller county road. It stayed behind me, matching every acceleration and brake. A knot formed in my stomach when the car didn't turn off at the next intersection. Instead, it stayed its shape just beyond the reach of my headlights. I flicked on my blinker and slowed, hoping to lose it in the winding roads ahead. The car followed without hesitation. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, sweat prickling in my palms despite the chill in the cab. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that the road was dark and maybe the driver was just lost. When I finally reached the small bridge that crossed the creek, I took a deep breath and pulled over, turning off the engine. The headlights behind me stopped a few feet short, flooding the cracked asphalt with an eerie glow. I sat frozen, heart pounding so loud it swallowed the quiet night. The other car idled, engine humming low, and then the headlights dimmed briefly before coming back on. Someone was watching me. I debated driving off, but the narrow road made that risky. The bridge was narrow, and the ditch on either side too deep. I tried to tell myself the driver was just waiting, maybe for a friend or to answer their phone. Still, I felt the weight of those eyes. I felt exposed. Finally, I unlocked my door and stepped out, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The night smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves, a sharp contrast to the sterile hospital where I'd been all evening. My breath puffed out in small clouds as I looked over my shoulder. The car's window rolled down with a slow mechanical whir. A man's face appeared, half-shadowed but unmistakably watching. He was older, maybe late 40s, with sharp eyes and a thin scar running down his left cheek. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Car trouble?" he asked, voice smooth but laced with something I couldn't place. "No, just taking a break," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Long drive?" He nodded, eyes flicking to the road behind me. "This stretch gets lonely. You never know who might be out here." I forced a laugh, but the humor was hollow. The warmth in my fingers was slipping, replaced by a creeping chill as I stood alone on the bridge with this stranger. "Thanks for checking," I said, edging back toward my car. He smirked. "No problem. Be careful." I jumped in immediately and locked the doors. The car behind me didn't move for several minutes, the engine still running. Then, without warning, the headlights cut off and the car vanished. I sat there, trembling, the silence pressing in. Should I call the police? I didn't know what to report, A guy stopping to check on me? My phone was dead. The battery had died hours ago, and I hadn't charged it before I left the hospital, distracted and exhausted. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, glancing in the mirror. No sign of the car. The relief was brief. Moments later, I saw it again, those same headlights flickering around the next bend, reappearing behind me like a bad omen. Panic flared. I accelerated, heart hammering, every nerve screaming to get away, but the dark road twisted, offering no escape route. I thought of stopping at the old gas station up ahead, the only place open this late, mostly a convenience for truckers. Maybe there'd be someone there. But then I thought better of it. I hadn't been alone with a stranger this close. Could I really trust anyone? I kept driving, the sense of being stalked tightening like a noose. My eyes darted to every shadow, every rustle in the trees lining the roadside. The wind whispered past the cracked windows in eerie sibilance, and I realized how isolated I was. Ahead, the faint glow of the gas station appeared. I pulled in quickly, lights flickering overhead, the pump's digital display buzzing faintly. The station was empty except for a weathered man behind the counter, watching the door with tired eyes. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles and years spent behind that counter. I nodded to him, breath shallow, and ran inside. Gas? I asked, though I hadn't checked my tank in hours. He shook his head. Closed. Pumps on the fritz. You just passing through? I hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Sorry to bother you. He shrugged. No bother. His eyes lingered on me a moment longer, then he looked away. I stepped back outside, and the car was parked at the far edge of the lot, but this time the driver was nowhere to be seen. The engine was off, and the darkness behind the building swallowed the spot where the car had sat. I caught my breath and got back into my car, locking the doors immediately. Maybe the guy was hiding, waiting for me to leave. Or maybe he had lost interest. I didn't want to wait to find out. As I pulled back onto the road, the radio sparked to life unexpectedly, cutting through the silence with static and fragments of old music. A chill raced down my spine as the signal warped and shifted. The signal faltered, and then a voice came through, low and distorted, barely audible. Why are you running? I slammed the radio off, my hand shaking. My reflection in the rearview mirror was pale and wide-eyed. The road stretched ahead, dark and unknowable. I kept driving, faster now, hoping the headlights wouldn't return, hoping I could put this night behind me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The night shift at the diner was usually the kind of job that dulled your senses. The steady hum of the neon sign outside, the clink of coffee cups, the occasional drunken customer with a story that wasn't quite true but entertaining nonetheless. Tonight was supposed to be no different. I clocked in at 10 p.m., my usual route to the corner booth where the manager kept the schedules and receipts. The place was almost empty, just the janitor whistling to himself as he mopped the floor near the back exit. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently overhead, casting a stuttering glow on the linoleum tiles that had seen better days. I poured a cup of coffee, its bitterness sharp against the quiet hum in my ears. It was cold outside, but the diner's old heater rattled to life, pushing a dry warmth through the cramped space. A shadow moved outside the front window just as I was about to sit down. I glanced over, but there was nothing there, just the street lamp's pale circle of light and the occasional car passing by. Maybe a stray cat, or a trick of the wind. I shook my head, trying to focus. The first customers trickled in around 11:15, a pair of teenagers who ordered fries and milkshakes and whispered behind their hands. I recognized one of them from the morning bus stop, a lanky kid with a buzz cut and a nervous edge to his smile. The kind of kid who always looked like he was waiting for someone to yell at him. They didn't stay long, leaving behind the usual clutter of ketchup packets and half-empty salt shakers. The next few hours passed in a dull blur, broken only by a few lonely regulars, a trucker who wanted black coffee in the evening news, a woman who always asked for decaf and read a battered paperback, the janitor who came in for a bathroom break around midnight. The clock near the cash register clicked forward, inching toward 2 a.m. It was just after that when I noticed the man sitting in the far corner booth. He hadn't been there when I'd taken my first break 15 minutes earlier. He was middle-aged, maybe late 40s, with a rough, unshaven face and pale eyes that caught the light like ice chips. His clothes were a mess, dirty jacket, scuffed boots, but what unsettled me most was the way he kept his hands folded on the table, motionless, like he was waiting for something or someone. I tried to ignore him, but the feeling that something was off kept gnawing at me. He didn't order anything, just stared out the window as if tracking someone's movements on the street. I caught him watching me once when I refilled a coffee pot. His eyes didn't flicker away like most people's would. Instead, they seemed to hold on, heavy and deliberate. I told myself it was nothing, maybe he was just tired, or waiting for a ride. But then, after a few minutes, the janitor came through the kitchen door and greeted me with a tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That guy looks like trouble," he said quietly, nodding toward the man. "Yeah, I noticed," I whispered back, feeling my palms grow clammy. The janitor shrugged. "I've seen him hanging around the gas station down the road the past few nights. No one talks to him much." I nodded, trying to focus on wiping down the tables, but my mind was racing. The man's presence, the way he watched, the strange stillness in the diner, it was all starting to feel less random and more deliberate. Around 2:30 a.m., the door chimed again. A woman entered, shaking off her umbrella despite the weather being dry all evening. She was soaked, like she'd been caught in a sudden downpour somewhere else. She scanned the room and her eyes landed on the man in the corner. Her expression tightened, but she continued toward the counter. "Coffee, black," she said to me, voice low but steady. I poured her a cup, watching as she took a slow sip. The man shifted in his seat just slightly, enough for me to notice. The tension between them was palpable, like an invisible thread binding their attention. I wanted to say something, warn her maybe, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I kept busy wiping down the counter and stealing glances at the man, who now held a folded newspaper in front of him. I thought I saw the faint outline of a photograph on the front page, but the dim lighting made it impossible to tell. "We don't get many people this late," I said, trying to break the heavy silence. She nodded but didn't answer. The man lowered the paper slowly, his gaze fixed directly on her now. That moment stretched out, a quiet standoff, before the woman finished her coffee and left without a word. I watched her hurry down the street, pulling her coat tighter around her. After a few minutes, the man stood up abruptly, leaving a crumpled dollar on the table. He didn't look at me or anyone else as he slipped out the front door and disappeared into the night. The diner felt colder once he was gone, even with the heater still sputtering away. I checked the clock, it was almost 3 a.m. I started cleaning up, but the feeling didn't leave me. The man's eyes, the woman's reaction, the way the janitor had warned me, all of it kept spinning in my head. I locked the back door as usual, but paused for a moment, listening. Outside, the street was empty except for the distant hum of cars on the highway. Just as I was turning off the neon sign, I noticed something on the floor near the booth where the man had sat, a folded scrap of paper, almost hidden beneath the cracked linoleum tile. I picked it up with a shaking hand. The words were scrawled quickly in black ink. "He's watching. Don't trust him." My heart hammered in my chest. I looked up toward the street, half expecting to see the man's pale eyes staring back. But the road was deserted, the street lamp's glow flickering against the creeping fog. I stuffed the note into my pocket and locked the diner's front door. Outside, the night was still, but something had changed. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. I didn't want to be the only one left here anymore. Story 2, Last Train to Silent Hollow. The night shift at the warehouse had a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, machines thrumming, cardboard rustling, and the occasional clatter of a dropped box echoing down the cavernous space. I had worked there for nearly 6 months, and by now, the routine felt so familiar that I sometimes caught myself zoning out while stacking pallets. I liked the quiet hours after midnight when most of the city was asleep, and I could move through the dimly lit aisles with a kind of solitary calm that daylight hours never afforded. That Tuesday, I clocked in at 11:45 p.m. and settled into my usual spot near the back loading dock. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows against the concrete walls. I checked my phone 1:17 a.m. and thought about the leftover sandwich I'd packed for a midnight snack. The break room was a few hundred feet away, but I figured I could eat quickly without losing track of time. As I walked toward the break room, I noticed the exit door at the far end of the warehouse was slightly ajar. It was unusual. Standard protocol was to keep all external doors locked except the main entrance, which was manned by security. The door wasn't wide open, just cracked enough for a sliver of cool night air to drift inside, carrying with it the faint scent of wet asphalt and exhaust fumes. I frowned. Maybe the janitor had left it open for a moment. I made a mental note to mention it during the morning shift briefing. In the break room, the humming of the vending machine was the only sound besides the ticking clock. It was empty except for me, so I grabbed my sandwich and a bottle of water, then sat down at the corner table beneath a flickering overhead light. As I pulled back the wrapper, I heard footsteps just outside the room, slow and deliberate. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no reply. The footsteps stopped abruptly, then resumed, fading away down the hallway. My stomach tightened. It was probably another night shift worker or one of the maintenance guys doing a late check. Still, I felt a little unnerved. Alone in a large, empty warehouse, strange sounds seemed amplified. Finishing my snack, I stood and headed back to my station, glancing over my shoulder as I did. The door at the far end was still open. That detail stuck with me more than it should have. I figured I would close it myself after finishing my shift. Back near my pallet stack, the overhead lights flickered again, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the open doorway. I shook my head, blaming tired eyes and the flickering light. The warehouse had 100 places to hide, and my mind was playing tricks in the low light. I resumed stacking boxes, trying to focus on the task at hand. The night dragged on, slow and methodical. Around 3 a.m., the usual background noise was interrupted by a loud bang from the loading dock end, the one with the open door. I froze, heart pounding. The bang sounded like something heavy falling, maybe a metal container or a pallet jack tipping over. I stood up and walked cautiously toward the noise, the beam of my phone flashlight cutting through the dark. The open door was swaying slightly now, pushed wider by a sudden gust of wind. Outside, I could hear the faint hum of distant traffic, but nothing else. No footsteps. No voices. I closed and locked the door, double-checking the latch. As I turned back inside, I caught sight of a figure moving just beyond the window's dark clothes blending into the night, standing still, watching. My breath caught. I blinked and looked again, but the figure was gone. An icy sweat broke out on my neck. I told myself it was probably a homeless person passing by or a worker from the neighboring warehouse out for a smoke break. Still, the feeling of being watched had settled heavily on me. I tried to shake it off, but the rest of the shift passed in a blur of unease. Every noise seemed sharper, the scrape of a box, the creak of the floor, the distant bark of a dog, the occasional car passing on the street outside. I kept my phone in hand, thumb resting on speed dial just in case. At 5 a.m., my replacement arrived, a tall guy named Mark who usually had a cheerful attitude. I told him about the open door and the noises, but he shrugged it off. Maybe someone forgot to lock up, he said. It's been a long night for you. We walked toward the exit together. As I fumbled with my keys, I noticed a small, muddy footprint on the concrete just outside the door. It was fresh, still damp from the night's rain. I hadn't seen any puddles near the entrance before, and the footprint was too large to be mine. Mark noticed it too and nudged it with his boot. Looks like someone really was out here, he said. Maybe a tired delivery guy or something. I nodded, but my heart was still racing. The realization that someone had been close enough to leave prints outside the door unsettled me far more than I wanted to admit. As we stepped into the cold dawn, I felt exposed in a way I hadn't before. The warehouse, usually a fortress of routine and familiarity, had revealed an unsettling vulnerability. I glanced back once more, half expecting to see those dark clothes lurking in the shadows. But the lot was empty. I told myself it was over for now. But the memory of that night, the open door, the footsteps, the watching figure would not let me rest easily. Something had been there. And it was still out there. I was supposed to meet Jen at the cafe on 8th and Market after work. It was a small place, just a block from my office, the kind of hole-in-the-wall spot with cramped tables and a rusty espresso machine that sputtered like it was about to give up any minute. The rain was steady, a cold drizzle that soaked through my coat before I even got out of the building. I pulled the hood up tighter and tried to ignore how the damp clung to the back of my neck, making me feel exposed and vulnerable. Inside the cafe, the air smelled like burnt coffee and the faint tang of wet wool from the coats hanging by the door. Jen wasn't there yet, so I picked a corner seat with a view of the street. I liked watching people pass by when it rained, everyone hunched over, collars up, trying to disappear from the world. I ordered a black coffee, no sugar, and pulled out my phone to scroll through the emails piling up. The cafe's bell jingled softly every time the door opened, and a few people shuffled in, mostly regulars, I guessed, nodding greetings to the barista. The place wasn't busy, but it had the quiet hum that made me relax after a day stuck in the fluorescent light of the office. I was halfway through my coffee when the door opened again, and a guy came in, soaked from the rain, dragging his feet on the mat like he was tired and cold. He had a baseball cap pulled low, and he kept rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm them up. Nothing about him seemed out of place at first glance, but then, as he stood near the counter waiting for his drink, he kept glancing over at me. Not just a quick glance, but like he was trying to read something on my face. I caught his eye once, and he looked away fast, but his stare stuck with me. I tried to shrug it off, maybe he thought I looked familiar. The barista handed him a cup, and he moved to sit at the table next to mine. The cafe was small, and the chairs were packed close together, so I could hear everything, the scrape of his boots on the floor, the soft slurp of his coffee. I tried to focus on my phone, but the silence between us felt heavy. The rain outside had picked up, tapping louder against the windows, and the dim light made everything seem a little cold and gray. After a few minutes, I caught him looking over again. This time, he didn't bother hiding it. What unsettled me was the way his eyes narrowed, like he recognized me but didn't want me to know he did. I turned away quickly, pretending to read an email, but my heart had picked up a steady beat. Jen finally showed up, pushing the door open with an apologetic smile. I felt a brief flicker of relief. I motioned her over, and as she slid into the seat across from me, the guy got up and left without a word. "Sorry I'm late," Jen said, pulling her scarf tight around her neck. Traffic was a nightmare. She looked tired, and I wanted to tell her about the guy, but I wasn't sure what to say without sounding paranoid. We talked about work and weekend plans, trying to shake off the strange feeling the cafe had left. But I kept glancing at the door every time it jingled. When we finished, Jen insisted on walking me back to my apartment. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and shiny under the streetlights. We took the long way through the park, following the path that cut behind the old library. The park was mostly empty, just a couple walking their dog in the distance, the leaves dark and dripping. I was glad for Jen's company, but my unease hadn't gone away. I noticed a man sitting on a bench ahead, his hoodie drawn tight over his head. He was looking down at his hands, but as we passed, I felt him glance up, right at us. "Did you see that guy in the cafe?" I asked Jen quietly. She frowned. "No, who?" I hesitated. There was this guy who kept looking at me. It was weird. He sort of watched me. Jen gave me a sidelong look. "Maybe you're just tired. You've been working too much." Maybe she was right, but I couldn't shake the prickling at the back of my neck. We turned off the path and headed toward my building. The streetlights flickered as we walked, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk. I kept checking over my shoulder. The park was empty now except for the man on the bench, and he was still there, unmoving. Jen stopped by the entrance to my building. "You sure you're okay?" I nodded, but my voice was tight. "Yeah, I'm fine." She gave me a quick smile and hurried off down the street. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling. The lock clicked open, and I pushed the door behind me, locking it immediately. The hallway was dark and smelled faintly of old carpet and stale air. I paused, pressing my back against the door, trying to calm my racing heart. Then I heard footsteps in the stairwell. Slow, deliberate, coming up from the floor below. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. Then, a faint scrape against the door, a soft, almost tentative sound, like someone testing if it was locked. I bolted down the hall to my apartment, slammed the door shut, and twisted the deadbolt. The key rattled in the lock, and I dropped it on the floor. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely breathe. I pressed my ear against the door, waiting, but the footsteps didn't come closer. They just stopped. Then, after what felt like an eternity, they retreated back down the stairs. I didn't move for 5 minutes, then grabbed my phone and called Jen. "Can you come back? I think someone was trying to get in." Her voice was calm but urgent. "I'm on my way." I locked every door and window I could find, pulled the curtains shut, and waited, the silence inside the apartment suddenly crushing. When Jen arrived, she stayed with me until I felt a little less like I was going to lose it. We called the police, who said they'd send someone by later to check the building, but with no clear suspect, there wasn't much they could do right away. That night, I left the lights on and sat with my back to the door, feeling like someone was just outside, watching. The rain started again, steady and cold, and I realized then that whoever it was, they hadn't finished with me. The evening sky was the kind of pale gray that made everything seem washed out, like the world had been drained of color and warmth. I was locking up the small cafe where I worked, just a few blocks from my apartment, in a neighborhood that still felt a little rough around the edges but was quiet enough at night. I was tired, my feet aching from standing almost non-stop, but I welcomed the familiar rhythm of shutting down the day's work. The soft click of the lock and the hum of the streetlights flickering on were strangely comforting. As I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the air had that damp chill that settles just before it rains. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me, pulling the collar up against the wind. The street was mostly empty, just a few parked cars and the occasional distant sound of a car passing by. I checked my phone 8:17 p.m. I still had a 20-minute walk home, but I usually liked the solitude at this hour. It gave me time to think, to unwind. I pulled my scarf closer as I walked. The pavement was slick from an earlier drizzle, reflecting the street lamps in scattered pools of yellow light. I kept my head down, ears tuned to the usual sounds of night, a dog barking somewhere behind a fence, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the faint thud of music from a nearby apartment. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, a noise caught my attention, footsteps. Not far behind me. Steady, deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder for a split second. No one. Just the empty street and the shadows cast by the flickering street lamps. I slowed my pace. The footsteps didn't match mine in pace, but they were close enough to make me uneasy. I told myself it was probably someone heading in the same direction, maybe a neighbor or a delivery person. Still, I didn't like the feeling of being followed. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out with shaking fingers. A text from my mom, just checking in. I thumbed out a quick reply, almost home. See you soon. The footsteps stopped. I froze, heart pounding, listening. The silence pressed in on me, thick and heavy. Then, after a long moment, they started again, but this time slower, more hesitant. I quickened my steps, trying to stay calm, but my breath came out in short bursts, visible in the cold air. Ahead, the street curved sharply to the left, lined with a row of closed shops and a narrow alleyway I always avoided. I debated cutting through the alley to save time or sticking to the main road. I chose the main road, even though it meant an extra 5 minutes. Whatever was behind me could be lurking there. That's when I heard a voice, low, rough, barely above a whisper. Hey! I stopped. The voice wasn't familiar, and it was close, too close. I turned slowly, scanning the dimly lit street. A man was standing just beyond the edge of a street lamp's glow, his face partially hidden under a hood. He didn't look like any of the usual people I saw around here. His eyes were fixed on me, cold and unreadable. "Can I help you?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He took a step forward, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Just wanted to say hi." The words were casual, but there was an edge to them, like a warning or a test. Something didn't sit right. "I'm just heading home," I said. He smiled then, but it was quick and unnatural, a flash of teeth that didn't reach his eyes. "We can walk together. It's safer." I wanted to laugh, to tell him I didn't need his protection, but my voice caught in my throat. Instinct screamed at me to move, to get away, but I felt rooted to the spot. "Thanks, but no," I managed to say. Turning back towards the street, I started walking again, faster this time. The man followed. I could hear the soft thud of his shoes on the pavement, matching my pace now. I glanced back once more. He was keeping just enough distance to be out of reach, but close enough to keep me in sight. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt sweat bead on my forehead despite the cold. I pulled out my phone again, fingers trembling. I debated calling someone, anyone, but the signal was spotty here. The battery was low, and the thought of having to explain why I was so scared felt foolish. What if he saw me reaching for my phone? What if he decided to do something worse? I kept walking, eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The streetlights flickered again, casting brief darkness that swallowed parts of the street whole. My breath came out ragged, and my legs felt shaky. Then the man spoke again, voice low and just loud enough for me to hear. "You don't have to be scared. I'm not going to hurt you." That only made it worse. Why say that if it wasn't true? What did he want from me? I saw my apartment building up ahead, the small squat silhouette with its chipped paint and the dull glow of a hallway light from the second-floor window. Relief surged through me, sharp and immediate. I was almost there. But as I reached the building's small front yard, he stopped. Just stood there, watching. I rushed up the steps, fumbling with my keys, hands shaking so badly I dropped one. The key clattered loudly on the concrete, and I bent to pick it up as fast as I could. Behind me, footsteps stopped again. I didn't look back. I unlocked the door and slipped inside, slamming it shut behind me. The lock clicked into place, and I leaned against the door, heart thrumming in my ears so loud I thought it might burst. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Silence. No footsteps. No voice. Just the muffled sounds of the street and distant traffic. I pulled out my phone and sat down on the floor, trembling as I texted my mom again. Got home. Locked up. All good. I stayed there for a few minutes, trying to calm my shaking hands and slow my racing heart. After a while, I checked the peephole. Nothing. No sign of him. I told myself it was over. That maybe he wasn't a threat after all, just someone lonely, or drunk, or messed up in some way. But the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. I knew I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if he came back? What if next time I wasn't so lucky? I locked every door and window, pulled every curtain tight, and sat in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the city beyond my walls. The room felt smaller somehow, the shadows longer. Outside, life went on, indifferent and unaware. But inside, I felt trapped, caught in a moment where safety was fragile, and danger had slipped just through the cracks. The late afternoon light was growing thin as I stepped out of the subway station onto the cracked sidewalk of 34th Street. I checked my phone out of habit, no signal. I'd been offline for a while, a self-imposed digital detox from the constant noise of work emails and social media. I'd planned to meet Ryan at the Corner Cafe, a place we discovered by chance a few weeks ago. It was quiet, tucked between a laundromat and a dry cleaner, the kind of spot where the hum of conversations was low and people rarely lingered. Perfect for escaping the city's usual chaos. I pulled my jacket tighter. The air had shifted, cooler than the weather app had predicted. A chill crawled up my neck, but I shrugged it off, focusing on the familiar route. I was halfway down the block when the first odd thing happened. A man stepped out of the laundromat behind me, pushing the door closed carefully, almost silently. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a wrinkled blue shirt and faded jeans, with a gray baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Nothing remarkable, except he didn't glance around, just kept his head down and started walking the same way I was going. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Lots of people walk this way during rush hour. But every few steps, he slowed as if matching my pace, then sped up again when I did. My stomach tightened. I tried not to look back. The street was fairly busy, people on their phones, a dog walker a few yards ahead, a couple arguing in hushed tones near the bus stop. Any of them could have noticed if something was wrong. I kept my stride steady, eyes forward. When I reached the cafe, I glanced inside. Ryan was already there, seated by the window, his laptop open and a half-empty cup of coffee beside him. Relief washed over me. I stepped inside, the warm smell of roasted beans and old wood enveloping me. "Hey, sorry I'm late," I said, sliding into the chair opposite him. "No worries," Ryan replied, looking up with a smile. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I laughed it off. Just a long day. My mind was elsewhere, still on the man outside. I pulled the window curtain aside and scanned the street. He was gone. Maybe he turned a corner. Ryan caught my expression. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Probably just paranoia." We talked about work, our plans for the weekend. The cafe gradually emptied as daylight faded into an orange glow. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. When I finally stood to leave, the man was waiting across the street, leaning against a lamppost. He looked up as I stepped out, his face half hidden by the cap's shadow. Our eyes met briefly before he looked away. My heart thudded, a cold knot forming in my chest. I crossed quickly, heading toward the bus stop 2 blocks down. The hum of the city at night was different, more distant, more hollow. I felt exposed, every footstep echoing. At the shelter, a woman with a stroller glanced at me, then away. The bus was late. I pulled out my phone to check the time. No signal. Panic prickled at the back of my mind. I pressed the power button, hoping for a reset, but the screen stayed black. I tried again. Nothing. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement. The man had crossed the street and was walking toward me, hands stuffed in his pockets, moving with a slow, deliberate gait. I looked around. The street was almost empty now. The bus stop was deserted except for me. My stomach churned. I considered turning and crossing back, but I felt trapped between the street and the empty storefronts behind me. I swallowed hard. The man stopped outside the shelter, about 10 feet away. He looked at me, then said something I couldn't hear over the distant traffic. His voice was low, gravelly. "Hey, can you help me out?" he called. I shook my head, trying to appear calm. "No." "Looked like you dropped something." He took a step closer. I scanned for any escape but saw none. The bus still hadn't arrived. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He shrugged. "Just trying to get by." His eyes were dark and unreadable. "You got a phone?" "I'm on my last battery." I hesitated. Could I trust him? Something about the way he spoke was off, like he was testing boundaries. "I don't have one," I said, stepping back. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "All right, no worries." He lingered a moment, then turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. The bus arrived seconds later. I climbed aboard, heart pounding, and sat near the back, eyes fixed on the door as it closed behind me. The ride home was a blur. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see the man chasing after the bus, but he never appeared. When I unlocked my apartment door, the familiar click of the lock and the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet brought a measure of comfort. I set my bag down and locked the door again, double-checking the deadbolt. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked the peephole. The hallway was empty. The building's dim lights flickered faintly. I tried my phone one more time. Signal. But there was a missed call from an unknown number. My fingers trembled as I stared at the screen. I didn't call back. Instead, I sat down, pulling the curtain shut, and listened to the quiet hum of the city outside, wondering if tonight had been just a coincidence or the start of something far worse. I didn't think much of it at first, the way the man had lingered near the entrance of the grocery store. I was just finishing up my weekly shopping, bagging the last of the cold cuts and the bread when I noticed him again. He was tall, a little too lanky, with a beat-up green jacket that looked like it hadn't seen a wash in weeks. His eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd in a way that felt more like hunting than waiting. I caught his gaze for a split second, and instead of looking away like most people do, he held it, just long enough for me to feel a prickling unease crawl up my spine. I shook my head, telling myself I was overreacting. The neighborhood had its share of rough characters. Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I paid for my groceries and stepped outside. The afternoon sun was waning, shadows stretching long across the cracked pavement. The air had that brittle sharpness that hinted at the end of fall, and the sky was a dull gray smudge. I clipped my jacket tighter around me and started walking toward the bus stop 2 blocks down. I needed to get home before dark. The man was still there. Not just near the store, he was walking parallel to me now, a good 10 feet away but matching my pace. I shifted to the other side of the street, passing a cluster of parked cars, but he mirrored the move, staying at the same distance. I tried not to look too obvious about it, but my heart thudded louder with each step. I told myself again that maybe I just looked nervous, and maybe he thought I was someone else. That was all it was. Nothing personal. When I reached the bus stop, I glanced down the street. No sign of the green jacket. Relief bloomed in my chest, but it was short-lived. As the bus approached, I saw him step onto it too, sliding in at the back. The bus doors closed behind him with a smooth, mechanical hiss. I hurried to the front and got on, sitting 2 rows ahead, near the window. I kept my eyes on the man, who now leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, staring out at the grimy cityscape. The bus rattled through the streets, stopping at dimly lit stops filled with transient figures and tired commuters. Every few minutes, I looked back. He didn't get off. He didn't move. Just sat, watching. I felt a growing knot of dread twist in my stomach. I tried to relax, telling myself I'd get off at my stop and be safe inside my apartment in 20 minutes. But then, the man got up and walked forward, passing right by me without a word, his breath smelling faintly of stale cigarettes. He didn't glance my way, but the weight of his presence was crushing, like a dark cloud settling over my chest. I got off at my stop, heart pounding so loud I thought it might echo in the empty street. The bus pulled away, and I hurried towards my building. The street was mostly deserted now, a few cars parked haphazardly, their windows reflecting the flickering streetlights. I fumbled with my keys, hands trembling, and finally let myself in. The familiar click of the door locking behind me should have brought comfort, but instead it felt like a flimsy barrier against the unknown. I went upstairs, turning on every light as I passed. The apartment smelled like stale coffee and old books, a comforting scent that made the tension inside me loosen just a little. I locked the deadbolt, checked the windows, and sat down on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself it was over. He couldn't have followed me home. The bus route wasn't direct, and I was sure he had gotten off somewhere else. Then came the knock. At first, I thought it was the wind. The kind of soft, uneven tap that sounds like someone trying the doorbell but giving up. But it came again, sharper this time. 3 quick, forceful raps. My throat went dry, and I didn't answer. I crept to the peephole and looked out. No one. The hallway was empty and dimly lit, but I saw something, a shadow, shifting at the edge of the light. I blinked. Nothing. Just my imagination. I told myself to calm down. Maybe a neighbor messing around. I ignored the door, pretending it wasn't there. But then the knocks turned to pounding, deliberate, urgent. The kind of noise that would wake anyone in the building. I moved away from the door, heart hammering, trying to figure out what to do. Call the police. But what would I say? That some guy was pounding on my door and I didn't know why. What if he had a weapon? I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and dialed 911. As I whispered my address to the dispatcher, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was worse, a heavy, expectant quiet that made every creak in the old building sound like a footstep. Then the knocking started again, this time slower, softer. Like he was toying with me, waiting for me to come to the door. I sank to the floor, sliding back against the wall, phone clenched in my hand, fingers icy cold. The dispatcher was still on the line, telling me an officer was on the way, but the minutes stretched out like hours. I thought about the bus, about the way the man had followed me so calmly, almost effortlessly. He knew the route, he knew where I lived. I hadn't seen his face properly, but something about him, the way he watched, was meant to unnerve. Like he wanted me to know he was there. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, slow. The door rattled as someone pressed against it with the weight of their body. I pressed my back harder against the cold wall, holding my breath. Then a voice, low and steady, but with an edge of menace. "Hey, I know you're in there. Just open up. I don't want to make this harder than it has to be." I didn't answer. The footsteps retreated, and the pounding stopped. The silence settled again, so thick I thought it might suffocate me. A few minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the night. The police arrived, knocking loudly, announcing themselves. I stepped away from the door, voice shaking as I told them what happened. They searched the building, checked the nearby streets, but there was no sign of him. I sat in my apartment for the rest of the night, lights on, phone close. I didn't sleep. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound a warning. The man with the green jacket was gone, for now, but I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Story 3, Whispers Beneath the Shattered Window. I had never felt especially uneasy walking home from the train station before. The route I took was routine, through a row of dimly lit streets lined with small shops and apartment buildings where most doors were unlocked by the time I passed. I left the station around 11 p.m., the last train from the city center. The weekend crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving only a handful of late-night wanderers and the occasional bicycle zipping through. That night, the air tasted faintly of rain, but the sky was clear. Streetlights flickered sporadically, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. I zipped my jacket up to my chin, the chilly breeze slicing through the fabric. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the empty walls behind me. The deeper I went into the neighborhood, the quieter it became. I had my earbuds in, playing a low-volume playlist of old blues songs, but I kept one earbud loose so I could still hear the world around me. As I turned onto Maple Street, something felt off, not a loud noise or a sudden movement, but an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, like the air was heavier and the shadows deeper. My skin prickled. I slowed my pace, glancing down the block. A man was leaning against the side of a closed convenience store, his hand shoved into a threadbare jacket. He was watching me. Not looking away or distracted, a fixed stare that made my stomach tighten. His face was shadowed, but I could see the glint of his eyes reflecting the streetlight. I passed at a distance, telling myself I was imagining it. Halfway down the block, the man stepped away from a wall and began walking in my direction, keeping a steady pace behind me. The sound of his footsteps was muffled, but I could catch them over the music now playing in my ears. They were deliberate, not random. An uneasy feeling crept up my spine. I kept looking over my shoulder, but every time I did, he was just far enough behind to slip out of clear view. When I stopped at a crosswalk, he did too, waiting beside me. The streetlight flickered again as we both stood there, and I caught a glimpse of his face unshaven, with a tired expression, and eyes that seemed too alert for someone standing so still. I tried to pretend I wasn't bothered, focusing on the faded lines of the crosswalk and the occasional rattling of a distant garbage truck. When the light changed, I hurried across, hearing his footsteps quicken behind me. My heart thumped harder as I neared the turn onto Birch Avenue, where my apartment building stood at the end of the block. By the time I reached my front door, hands fumbling for my keys, the man was less than 10 feet behind me. I glanced back once and caught him watching, his mouth slightly parted as if he wanted to say something or maybe just breathe. My fingers trembled, and it took 3 tries to get the lock undone. I slipped inside, locked the door, and leaned against it with a shaky breath. The hallway was dark except for the red glow of the emergency exit sign. I tried to calm myself, telling myself he was probably just wandering home late, or maybe waiting for someone. But then I heard footsteps outside, the slow, deliberate kind that made my blood turn cold. Not the quick patter of someone passing by, but measured steps pacing the hallway in front of my door. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear over the pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped. Then, a faint shuffle. A soft scrape as if something was being dragged along the floor. My breath caught, and I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking too much to unlock it right away. A sharp knock rattled the door frame. Not a normal knock, more like the edge of a fist hitting hard, 3 times in rapid succession. My heart exploded in my chest. I whispered, "Who's there?" but the only answer was silence. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt locked in place. The knock came again, slower this time. Then silence. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds, I couldn't tell. I was frozen, my eyes fixed on the peephole, willing the shadow beyond to disappear. Then, footsteps retreated. I heard the scrape again, fading down the hallway. I waited another long minute before I dared to unlock the door just enough to peer out. The hallway was empty. No sign of a man. I didn't sleep that night. The apartment felt too quiet, too vulnerable, like a thin veil separating me from something dangerous lurking just beyond the walls. I kept checking the locks, the windows, the peephole. By morning, the tension had ebbed slightly, replaced by a dull ache of exhaustion. I told myself it was a coincidence, that he had no interest in me, just a late-night wanderer caught in an empty corridor. But when I checked my phone, there was a message I hadn't seen before. It wasn't a text, but a photo. A picture of the sidewalk outside my building. Taken from ground level, close enough to see my doorstep. No words, no sender. I stared at it for a long time, my hands tightening into fists. I didn't know who had sent it or how they got so close without me noticing, but the message was clear: I had been watched. And if he knew where I lived, then the man wasn't just a stranger on the street. He was someone willing to cross boundaries, maybe even cross into my home. I locked the door again, pulled the curtains tight, and sat by the window, staring out into the street where the shadows still lingered. The city moved on around me, unaware. But I knew better now. There was no way the night's events were over. The shift ended just after midnight, and I locked up the convenience store behind me. The quiet street was empty except for the occasional car passing by, headlights briefly illuminating the cracked sidewalks. I liked working late hours, the solitude, the steady rhythm of serving the few night customers, and coming home to an empty apartment where I could decompress. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the weather, a thick fog had rolled in, muffling sounds and swallowing the streetlight's glow, or maybe it was just me. I checked my phone as I walked to the bus stop a block away. No missed calls or messages, just the usual slew of notifications I never had time to read during the shift. The bus was due in 10 minutes, so I stood on the curb, hands jammed deep in the pockets of my jacket, trying not to focus on the figure sitting on the bench across the street. I hadn't noticed him before. He was hunched over, shoulders shaking slightly, his breath making little clouds in the chilly air. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the outline beneath a dark hoodie. I told myself not to worry. Maybe he was homeless, waiting out the cold until a shelter opened or a friend could pick him up. But as I glanced at him again, he moved abruptly, standing up and walking slowly toward my side of the street. I shifted my weight, eyes darting to the empty road behind me. There was a flicker of movement. He stopped, then veered away, disappearing down a side alley. The bus hadn't come yet. I debated crossing the street to the bench and asking if he needed help. But something about the way he moved didn't sit right. He wasn't staggering or slurring his words. His steps were deliberate, almost cautious, like he was watching me as much as I was watching him. The hairs on my neck prickled. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept my gaze fixed on the approaching bus headlights. The bus arrived, and I climbed aboard, sinking into a seat by the window. I looked back toward the street, but the man was gone. The bus's interior was dim, and only a few other passengers stirred from their own pockets of silence. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself it was just paranoia. I'd had a long day, and foggy nights always threw me off. About 10 minutes later, the bus pulled up to my stop. It was a lonely stretch of road lined with tall pines and old street lamps spaced far apart. I stepped off, pausing to check my phone for the time. Suddenly, a faint rustle came from one of the trees. I stopped moving, listening. The wind didn't sound like that. It was a soft, shuffling noise, like someone brushing against branches. I told myself again it was nothing. Probably an animal. Still, I started walking faster. The street lamps created circles of yellow light, but the gaps between them were pools of darkness that seemed to lean in. I tried not to look over my shoulder, but the feeling of being watched crept in, crawling under my skin. Halfway to my apartment, I heard footsteps behind me. Soft, steady. I didn't dare turn around. I broke into a jog, the soles of my shoes slapping against the cracked pavement. The footsteps quickened, matching my pace. I risked a glance. A man, mid-30s, wearing a baseball cap pulled low, jogging a few yards behind. His face was mostly shadowed, but his eyes caught the light briefly, dark, focused. My heart hammered in my chest. I crossed the street, then the next block, hoping to lose him in the maze of side streets. But each time I changed direction, he followed. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I yanked it out, hands trembling, but it was just a weather alert. I considered calling 911, but the idea of yelling for help on these empty streets felt hopeless. I was alone, vulnerable, and no one would hear me. Turning down a narrow alley to my right, I hoped to slip behind the buildings and reach my apartment's back entrance faster. The alley was littered with trash and smelled faintly of damp wood and rot. The streetlight at the mouth of the alley flickered erratically, casting long, jittery shadows. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I stopped and spun around. The man stood 10 feet away, breathing heavily, eyes locked on mine. There was no smile, no greeting, just an expression that was hard to read. His mouth twitched, like he wanted to say something but didn't. "Hey," I said, voice uneven. "You lost?" He took a step closer. "No," he said quietly. "Just making sure you get home safe." My skin crawled. That wasn't a kindness, it was a threat dressed up as concern. I backed away, fumbling for my keys. My fingers trembled, and I dropped them on the ground. They clattered loudly against the concrete. He smiled then, a brief, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let me help," he said. I darted past him, heart racing, and sprinted toward the back door. It was unlocked, as usual. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it quickly. The apartment was dark and quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I leaned against the door, sliding down to the floor, hands pressed over my pounding chest. I called my roommate, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I didn't want to call the police yet, no proof, just a gut feeling and a guy who could probably vanish into the fog outside. I pulled the curtains tight and double-checked all the locks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my window. I turned on every light in the living room and sat by the front door, clutching a kitchen knife. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old building made me jump. Hours passed, then dawn's pale light crept under the blinds. The man was gone. No footsteps outside, no signs that he tried to get in. Just the lingering dread, the knowledge that someone had followed me home, that now I wasn't safe in the one place I thought I could be. I didn't know who he was, or what he wanted, but I knew one thing for sure, the night hadn't ended when I'd left work. It was only just beginning. I had never been one to stay late at the office, but that Wednesday, things had gotten away from me. Deadlines, meetings, and an unexpected report meant I didn't leave until almost 10 p.m. The parking lot was mostly empty when I got out to my car, and the cold air hit me sharper than I expected for early spring. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and pressed the key fob to unlock the driver's side door. The usual beep echoed through the near-empty lot, but then, somewhere beyond the edge of the parking rows, I heard what sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, but not hurried. I glanced toward the dim street lamp at the far end. There was no one there. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was probably just someone locking up late or heading to their car like me. The office building was in a business park, not exactly a bustling area at night, but not deserted either. Still, the sound of those footsteps had unnerved me. I slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately without even starting the engine. My phone buzzed, a text from my sister, checking in if I wanted to grab coffee the next day. I thumbed out a quick reply, trying to focus on something normal, but through the windshield, out there in the parking lot, the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As I backed out, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye near the entrance to the lot. A figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light, tall enough to be a man, but the shadows swallowed the rest. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I told myself I must be imagining things. Maybe a security guard or a janitor finishing up. I eased onto the road and headed home. The drive was quiet, the radio off, just the hum of the engine and the occasional groan of the tires on wet asphalt from the light rain that had started. My neighborhood was usually calm, but as I turned onto my street, I noticed a car parked halfway up the block that I didn't recognize. It was an older model, dark blue, with tinted windows. The kind of car that didn't belong here. The street was mostly empty at this hour. Most of my neighbors had already turned in. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I pulled into my driveway, locking the doors as soon as I was inside the house. The lights in the living room flickered briefly before settling. I wondered if the storm was messing with the power. I tried to focus on something mundane, putting my keys on the table, taking off my shoes, but the quiet stretched too long and the house felt too empty. The windows to the backyard revealed nothing but the swaying shadows of the trees. Then the phone rang. I jumped, nearly dropping it. The caller ID was blocked. "Hello?" I said, voice hollow. No answer. Just a faint, steady breathing on the other end. I hung up, heart pounding. I told myself it was a prank call, probably someone messing around, kids in the neighborhood or some random telemarketer with a glitch. I tried locking the front door again, even though it was already locked, double-checking the deadbolt. I peeked through the peephole, nothing but darkness. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak, every distant sound made me sit bolt upright. I kept imagining footsteps outside my windows or the faint outline of someone standing beyond the porch light. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed again. Another blocked number. This time, I didn't answer. Instead, I texted my sister, telling her to call me first thing. My mind raced with all the what-ifs. What if someone was watching? What if that car was waiting for me to come home? What if those footsteps in the parking lot weren't imagined? The feeling of being trapped in my own home, a place I should have felt safest, was nothing like the usual unease that came with late nights. Before dawn, I heard the scrape of something heavy near the back door. I froze, listening. A faint, metallic tapping. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and crept silently to the kitchen window overlooking the backyard. There, in the shadows, I saw a figure crouched near the door. He was wearing dark clothes and a hoodie that obscured his face. My breath caught. He straightened and looked toward the house, but from the kitchen, I was hidden. I dialed 911, whispering my address, trying not to make a sound. The operator stayed on the line, reassuring me that officers were on the way. The figure paced near the door, pulling at the handle, which was locked tight. Then, after a few minutes, he stepped back, looked around again, and disappeared into the night. The sirens came moments later, flashing blue and red through my front windows. 2 officers circled the house, shining their flashlights into the backyard and checking all entrances. They found no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the damp earth, just a faint scrape marks on the bottom of the door frame. They took my statement, asked if I had any enemies or recent conflicts. "No," I said. "Nothing like this." They told me to stay at a neighbor's house if I felt unsafe and that they would patrol the area more regularly. I thanked them, but even after they left, the house felt hollow. I sat on the couch, the bat resting across my lap, and tried to convince myself this was over. But as dawn broke, I realized whatever this was, it wasn't finished. The afternoon had been ordinary enough, the kind of quiet day I usually appreciated after long shifts at the diner. I left work at 4, the sun just starting to lean westward, casting that soft amber glow that makes everything look a little warmer, a little safer. I was tired, my feet aching from hours on concrete, and all I wanted was to go home, make a cup of tea, and read for a while before dinner. The neighborhood was usually calm in the late afternoon, families walking dogs, kids on bikes, the usual suburban hum. But that day, something felt off the moment I stepped out of the diner. I noticed a man leaning against a lamppost across the street. Nothing unusual about that in itself. People waited for buses, for friends, but there was something about the way he held himself. His eyes were fixed on me, not just glancing, but watching, unblinking, like a predator sizing up prey. I caught his gaze and immediately looked away, crossing the street quickly. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was bored or waiting for someone else. Still, the knot in my stomach tightened. Walking past the corner store, I bought a bottle of water and checked my phone. No new messages, no missed calls. The streets behind me were quiet, save for the faint hum of distant traffic. I decided to take a slightly longer route home, one that cut through a narrow alley between 2 apartment buildings. It wasn't the best idea, looking back, but it was faster, and I wanted to get home before dark. The alley was shaded and a bit grimy, litter scattered along the edges, crumpled soda cans, old flyers, a broken umbrella. The usual graffiti adorned the brick walls, faded tags overlapping like layers of forgotten conversations. I kept my steps steady, my eyes scanning the shadows. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and something metallic, maybe rust or old car oil. Halfway through, I heard footsteps behind me. Not loud, just soft enough to be heard if I listened closely. I stopped and waited. The footsteps paused too, then resumed, matching my pace. My heart started to race, breath quickening, but I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just someone heading home too. I veered slightly to the right, hoping to pass an open doorway where I could slip in and lose whoever was behind me. But the footsteps didn't falter. They followed. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over the flashlight app, but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make a scene or give away my fear. The alley was long, but I could just make out the street at the far end, where the light was better. If I kept walking, I could be out of there in less than a minute. I didn't dare look back again. Instead, I tightened my grip on the water bottle. It felt ridiculous, but it was something solid in my hands. The footsteps grew a little louder, matching my pace precisely, like a shadow mimicking every movement. Suddenly, I heard a low voice whisper behind me. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close, so close my skin prickled. I broke into a jog, heart slamming against my ribs like a hammer. The voice followed, repeating something indistinct, urgent. Bursting out of the alley, I found myself on a surprisingly busy street. Cars passed, people chatted on sidewalks, oblivious. I slowed, trying to shake the panic. I glanced behind me. No one. I told myself I must have imagined the voice, the footsteps. Maybe the man from the lamppost had left. Maybe I was just exhausted. But the tightness in my chest didn't ease. I kept moving, crossing the street toward the bus stop where I hoped to catch a ride home. The bus wouldn't come for 20 minutes, so I sat on the cold metal bench, trying to calm down. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You're not as careful as you think." I froze, fingers trembling. The bus stop was crowded enough that no one noticed me staring at the screen, pale and shaken. I debated calling the police but didn't want to seem paranoid without proof. My hands swept through my hair, trying to steady my breath. Another buzz. This time a photo, a picture of me, sitting right there on the bench, taken from across the street. I looked around frantically. No one seemed out of place, just regular commuters scrolling on their phones or chatting quietly. My pulse surged. Whoever it was could be watching me right now. I typed back, hand shaking, "Who's this?" No reply. The bus arrived, and I boarded quickly, sitting near the front where the driver could see me. I kept glancing out the window. The streetlights flickered as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretching unnaturally long. I thought about calling my roommate, but decided against it. I didn't want to scare her or seem hysterical. When I got off at my stop, the neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears like a weight. I walked swiftly, keys gripped in my fist, eyes peeled for any sign of someone following. The lampposts flickered overhead, one casting a brief, sickly yellow light before sputtering out. I turned the corner and froze. A figure stood at the end of my driveway, leaning against my car. My breath caught in my throat. He looked up, eyes meeting mine, expression unreadable but cold. It was the man from the lamppost. I fumbled for my keys, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you doing here?" He smiled, slow and unnerving. "Just waiting." I unlocked my door and slipped inside, locking it behind me with trembling hands. I peered through the peephole. He was gone. The street was empty, bathed in the weak glow of the streetlights. I sat down heavily, my heart pounding, the silence around me thick with menace. My phone buzzed again. No message this time, just a call from the unknown number. I let it ring until it stopped. It was no longer a coincidence. Someone was watching me, waiting, and now they had crossed the line from shadow to reality. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew one thing: this was far from over. I still remember the way the house smelled that night: damp wood and stale cigarette smoke, a stubborn odor that clung to the peeling wallpaper and faded curtains. It was just after 9. I had come back from a late shift at the diner, and the street was quiet except for the occasional bark of a stray dog somewhere down the block. The porch light flickered on and off, casting uneven shadows that made the flower pots look like distorted faces. I fumbled for my keys, the cold metal slipping in my sweaty palm. The door was unlocked. I must have forgotten to lock it earlier. Inside, the weak glow of the living room lamp was already on, the light bulb buzzing faintly. "Sarah?" I called out, dropping my bag by the shoes. No answer. There was always silence when she was asleep, but usually I'd hear the low hum of the TV or music drifting from the kitchen radio. I shrugged it off. Maybe she had gone out or was at a friend's place. I headed toward the bedroom. That's when I noticed the front door wasn't just unlocked, it was slightly ajar. A cold slice of air seeped in from the hallway, and I froze for a heartbeat. The door creaked a little more as I pushed it closed, my fingers trembling. The lock clicked into place, but the unease settled deeper into my chest. I stepped back inside and scanned the living room. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The couch cushions were as I left them in the afternoon, the coffee table neat, a half-empty mug of coffee sitting on the edge. Then I spotted it, a single muddy footprint on the beige carpet, right near the entrance. It was small, like a woman's shoe, and the dirt was fresh, dark against the fabric. My throat tightened. I pulled out my phone, hand shaking enough to almost drop it. No new messages or missed calls. No sign of Sarah. I tried her number again. Straight to voicemail. The pit in my stomach grew heavier. I remembered the old security camera footage I had set up by the front door. Not great quality, but something was better than nothing. I pulled out my laptop from the bag and plugged it in. The screen flickered to life, the little device humming quietly as I played back the footage from earlier that evening. Nothing unusual until around 7:15 p.m. The grainy image showed a man walking past our porch, hands deep in his jacket pockets, head down. Nothing alarming on its own. But then he stopped, looked directly at the camera, and lingered there for a few seconds, his expression unreadable. The camera's timestamp blinked, 7:17 p.m. After that, he walked slowly down the street, glancing over his shoulder as he disappeared into the dark. The timing was off, though. Sarah was supposed to be home by then. Where was she? I decided to check the backyard, the part of the house we rarely used. As I stepped through the kitchen door leading outside, my eyes adjusted to the shadowed yard tangled with overgrown weeds. The garden gate creaked on its hinges, slightly open. I closed it with a snap and noticed the fence boards nearest the gate were scratched, as if someone had tried to force their way through. Something about the scratches felt too methodical to be a random animal. They were deliberate, thin lines clawed vertically along the wood. A warning? Or just a sign someone had been trying to get in or out? I called the local police non-emergency number and explained the situation. They promised to send someone by soon to do a welfare check. The operator's voice was calm, but I could hear the underlying skepticism. Missing persons calls without clear evidence often didn't get immediate priority. Still, I was grateful for the reassurance. I paced the living room, glancing at every shadow, every corner. The muffled sound of sirens swelled in the distance, growing louder. When the two officers arrived, I let them inside, explaining everything: the unlocked door, the footprint, the man on the footage, the scratched fence. They took notes and asked questions, their flashlights probing the dark house. One of them, a gruff man with a thick mustache, said, "Anything else you noticed? Any strange phone calls or visitors lately?" I thought hard. No. Nothing. Except for the man outside the house that evening, and then the feeling, like someone was watching me. Like I was being followed home last week. I hadn't told anyone about that because I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. The officers promised to keep an eye on the neighborhood. They advised me to stay with a friend or family member until Sarah was found. I nodded absently, my mind racing with dark possibilities. After they left, I sat down heavily on the couch, trying to slow my rapid breathing. The house felt heavier now, like the walls themselves held their breath. I looked at the clock. It was just past 11 p.m. The street outside was silent again, but the quiet was different, thicker, as if it was waiting for something. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number: "You don't know what you're getting into. Stop looking." I stared at the screen, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The room felt colder. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching toward me. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice caught in my throat. I locked every door and window, checked the locks twice. Then I sat by the front window, phone in hand, watching the street. The porch light flickered again. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that someone had been inside our home or that they were still out there, watching, waiting. Either way, everything had changed. The night was far from over. Story 4, Midnight Caller in the Empty Office. I never thought much about the small town I moved to until the night everything started to feel wrong. It was late April, and the days were stretching longer, but the evenings still carried a chill that seeped into my apartment's thin walls. I lived alone on the third floor of a brick building that was probably built sometime in the 60s, not the kind of place where you expected anything exciting to happen. Mostly, it was just quiet. Too quiet, sometimes. That Tuesday, I got off work around 9. I worked a late shift at the grocery store on Main Street, cashiering under the fluorescent lights while customers shuffled past tired and distracted. I didn't mind the late hours. It kept me away from the crowded rushes of daytime. On my walk home, the streets were empty except for the occasional car slipping by. The sidewalks glistened faintly, slick from a recent drizzle, and the air smelled faintly of wet concrete and something else, something that I couldn't quite place. As I approached my building, I noticed a car parked across the street, a dark sedan with its engine running. That caught my attention, mainly because it seemed out of place. Most people parked in the lot behind the building or the side streets. The sedan's windows were tinted too dark, so I couldn't see inside. Usually, I didn't give much thought to cars or strangers, but this one felt different. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder as I reached the steps. Inside the building, the lobby was dim. The overhead light flickered intermittently, casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. I fumbled with my keys, the metal jangling loudly in the silence. When the door clicked shut behind me, I felt a momentary relief. The familiar creak of the hallway floorboards greeted me as I climbed to the third floor. Halfway up, I paused, thinking I heard something faint, the tapping of footsteps behind me, soft and irregular. I stopped, my breath catching. The building was almost always empty this late. Neighbors rarely came or went after dark. I waited, straining my ears. The silence pressed in again. Maybe it was the old pipes or settling wood. I told myself that, but the unease lingered. I reached my apartment door, unlocked it, and slipped inside, locking it behind me. The deadbolt slid into place with a satisfying click. Once inside, I set down my bag and flicked on the kitchen light. The apartment was modest, one bedroom, a small living area, and a kitchenette. I liked the view from the window, which faced the parking lot and, beyond that, the dark outline of the woods that bordered the edge of town. I hadn't spent much time near the woods, mostly because stories about people getting lost or worse had circulated among locals since I arrived. I glanced out the window and saw the sedan still parked across the street, idling quietly. I tried to brush off the feeling that something was off. Maybe the driver was waiting for someone. I shut the curtains, but the unease didn't fade. Around 10, I decided to unwind with a book. The apartment's only overhead light was harsh and unforgiving, so I lit a small lamp beside the couch. The yellow glow was comforting, and I told myself to relax. The night was mine. Half an hour later, I heard a noise from the hallway outside my apartment, soft knocks, 3 quick taps followed by a pause, and then 2 more. I froze. No one was supposed to be out there, especially not at this hour. I peeked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty and dimly lit by a flickering bulb down the hall. I considered not answering, but the knocking came again, more insistent this time. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for anything unusual. A scraping noise followed, like fingernails against wood. I pulled back, heart hammering. Who is it? I called through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I waited, but the hallway remained silent. The knocking stopped. I checked the peephole again. Still nothing. The whole building felt unnervingly quiet, even for this time of night. I locked the door again, double-checked all the windows, and even slid a chair against the door handle for extra security. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a neighbor confused the floor numbers or someone messing around. Still, the image of that dark sedan outside kept creeping back into my mind. By midnight, I was too restless to sleep. I sat by the window, the curtains half open, watching the empty street. The sedan was gone. But something else caught my eye, a man standing under the street lamp a block away. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, and his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. He wasn't moving much, just standing there, staring down the street in my direction. I blinked and looked again, but the man was still there. I felt my skin crawl. If someone had just been knocking at my door, was this connected? My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone to call the non-emergency police line, but the signal was weak. I tried again. Nothing but static. I pulled the curtains closed, tried to tell myself I was imagining things. Maybe he was waiting for someone else. Maybe this was all coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, my building's landlord stopped by unexpectedly. He was an older man with a gruff voice and a face weathered by years of hard work. He mentioned the street lamp in front of the building was scheduled for replacement because it sometimes flickered. I told him about the knocking and the man outside. He frowned. "You sure it wasn't a prankster?" "Sometimes kids get bored around here," he said. I nodded, but his words did little to ease my unease. That night, I installed a small motion sensor light by my door and changed the locks on my apartment. I told a coworker about the night's events, and she suggested I stay with a friend for a while. I laughed it off. But as I lay in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building settling, the sense of being watched didn't leave me. The idea that someone had been outside my door, knocking and scraping, someone who didn't respond when I asked who it was, forced me to confront a terrifying possibility that the quiet town I thought I knew was not as safe as I had believed. And that night had only been the beginning. It was just past 6 when I left the diner, the late afternoon sun dipping slowly behind the low hills that skirted the edge of town. I had been on my shift all day, working the register and cleaning tables, the usual weekend crowd scattering now that Sunday was winding down. The mood was light in the kitchen, a few of the cooks joking about the next big game, but I was eager to get home. I needed a shower and a chance to sit down somewhere quiet. The air outside had cooled suddenly, carrying the sharp tang of wet earth and something else, something faint and sour that I couldn't place. I locked the door behind me and started the short walk to my car, parked a few spaces down near the far end of the lot where the streetlights hadn't been replaced in years. The bulb above my car flickered as I passed beneath it, casting an intermittent glow over the cracked asphalt. I slowed for a second and looked around. The lot was almost empty, save for a pickup truck idling near the entrance. The driver's window was rolled down a crack, but I couldn't see anyone inside. I shook it off and slipped into the driver's seat, pulling the key from my pocket and shifting it into the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, and for a moment I thought I might just stay in the car, wait a few minutes to see if anyone came near. But nothing happened. The truck stayed put, silent except for the occasional cough of the engine. I backed out slowly, careful not to hit the crumbling curb. As I turned the wheel to head toward the main road, a figure appeared at the edge of the lot, standing close to the side of the diner. I caught the silhouette of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket too heavy for the season. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and he stood unnervingly still, his head tilted slightly, watching me. I blinked and the figure was gone. The street was quiet as I pulled onto the two-lane road, the only sound the soft hum of tires on worn pavement and the occasional chirp of crickets from the ditch. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. I glanced in the rearview mirror but saw nothing save for the empty road behind me. The truck from the parking lot wasn't following, at least not yet. I made a right onto Willow Bend Road, a narrow, twisting stretch that ran through a patch of woods before connecting back to the highway. The trees arched overhead, their branches forming a latticework that filtered the fading light. The air had cooled further, and the scent of damp leaves and pine was thick between the trunks. I rolled up the window, suddenly aware of how exposed I was on this road, miles from any real help. Halfway down Willow Bend, the headlights of a car came up behind me, bright and insistent. I checked the speedometer. I wasn't going over the limit, maybe even a little under. Still, the car tailgated me for the next several minutes, riding my bumper with nothing but empty road ahead. Every time I glanced at the mirror, I caught those two bright headlights, the shape of the vehicle just barely visible, a dark sedan, clean and unmarked. The driver stayed hidden in shadow. I wanted to pull over, let the car pass, but the nearest shoulder was a narrow strip of gravel, overgrown with brambles and weeds. I thought about turning around, but the road was winding and unfamiliar beyond this point. Instead, I tried to shake the feeling growing in my chest, that prickle of unease I'd learned to recognize all too well. It wasn't paranoia. Something about the way the car followed me was deliberate. Watching. When I reached the fork near the old mill, I hesitated. Turning left meant a longer route home, but it was better lit and more traveled. Turning right would cut the trip by 10 minutes but led deeper into the forest, where cell reception was spotty and the road narrowed even further. I chose left, the safer option. The car followed. I didn't dare glance in the mirror again until I reached the town's edge, where streetlights returned and the houses began to cluster. Even then, the sedan stayed behind, its lights dimming briefly before creeping back on as we moved into the neighborhood. I pulled into my driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me with a satisfying click. My hands trembled as I dropped my bag on the floor and checked the windows. All were shut tight, the curtains drawn. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant barking of a dog next door. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a coincidence, maybe someone returning from a late errand, but the sinking feeling in my stomach refused to ease. I kept watch from the living room window, peering through the blinds at the darkened street. The sedan was gone. I was sweaty and restless, moving from room to room, checking locks, listening for sounds that might not be there. Around midnight, the phone rang once. I froze, heart pounding, then grabbed it quickly. No one was on the line. Just static. The next morning, I found a scrap of paper tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. It was blank except for a single word scrawled in messy handwriting: soon. I didn't know who had left it or what it meant. The police said they'd keep an eye on the area but cautioned me to be careful and report anything suspicious. That day, I didn't go to work. I stayed inside, windows locked, blinds shut tight. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every shadow in the corner of the room stretched out longer than it should. I kept glancing at the door, waiting for it to open, for someone to step inside. By evening, I had convinced myself that maybe it was some twisted prank, a random act of intimidation by someone I didn't know. But the sense of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the edge of my vision, refused to fade. When the lights went out suddenly at 9:47 p.m., plunging the entire block into darkness, I realized this was no longer just a game. I sat in the dark, phone in hand, listening for the sound of a key turning in the lock. But none came. The power flickered back on minutes later, and I was left holding my breath, trapped in the quiet aftermath, waiting for whatever would come next. I had never been one to notice the little details in my daily routine. Usually, the hum of normalcy was a comfort: coffee brewing, the scrape of my keys, cars passing outside my window. But that day, As I settled into the small diner near the bus station, something shifted in the atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable. It started with the man at the counter. He wasn't unusual in appearance, average height, wearing a plain gray hoodie and worn jeans, but there was something off about the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, like he was waiting for someone or watching for a signal. His eyes were sharp but jittery, and when I caught him looking directly at me for a brief moment, he quickly turned back to his cup of black coffee. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a touch of nervousness or just the residue of a rough morning. The diner itself was a faded relic from the 1970s, the kind of place where the vinyl booths cracked under you and the fluorescent lights hummed a steady, low buzz. It was almost empty for mid-afternoon. Most people at the bus station preferred the newer cafes a few blocks down. I sat by the window, nursing my lukewarm tea and pretending to read the newspaper, but my attention kept flicking back to the man. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, the kind that promised rain but never quite delivered. A light drizzle had started, the drops tapping softly against the pane, blurring the world beyond. I noticed a group of teenagers huddled under a rusted bus shelter across the street, their laughter sharp and sudden, breaking the monotony. One of them caught my eye and grinned, a quick flash of teeth that felt too knowing, too deliberate. I looked away quickly, heart beating a little faster. The man at the counter stood up, his movements abrupt and tense. He threw a few coins on the counter and left without a word. I watched through the window as he walked out into the drizzle, his head down, hood pulled low. Then he stopped at the corner, just out of sight from the diner, and waited. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But when I stepped outside for a smoke, the feeling didn't fade. The street was empty except for a couple of cars parked far down the block. The rain had picked up, soaking through the thin fabric of my jacket almost immediately. I lit my cigarette and leaned against the wall of the diner, watching through the misty air. That's when I saw him again, the man. He was standing beneath a street lamp, the light flickering and casting long shadows. He didn't move as I did, but his eyes were fixed on me, expression unreadable. I looked away, telling myself to finish the smoke and go back inside. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing against the wet pavement. They weren't from behind me, but from the direction I was facing. I glanced up just in time to see a figure emerge from the haze, a woman this time. She was wearing a dark coat, her hair pulled back tightly, but what caught my attention was the backpack slung over one shoulder and the way she paused to stare at me with an intensity that felt invasive. I dropped the cigarette and crushed it under my heel. My stomach tightened as she started walking toward me, not quickly, but with steady, unyielding purpose. I took a step back and reached for the diner's door handle, heart racing. She kept coming, eyes locked on mine, lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. "Excuse me," she said, voice low but clear. "Do you know the way to 5th and Main?" Something about her tone was off, too controlled, too rehearsed. I managed to nod, pointing down the street, though the intersection was actually a few blocks away. She didn't respond. Instead, she looked past me, scanning the empty street behind. Suddenly, the man from the diner appeared again, emerging from the shadows near the corner. The woman's gaze flicked to him, and for a moment they exchanged a look that made my skin crawl. It was silent, but the tension between them was palpable, like two predators acknowledging each other. I took a half step back, wanting to disappear into the diner, but the woman's eyes snapped back to me, sharper now. "You live around here?" she asked. I shook my head. "Just passing through." Her lips twitched, almost a smile, but it vanished quickly. "Be careful," she said, voice dropping to a whisper. "These streets aren't what they seem." Before I could respond, she slipped past me and melted into the gray haze down the street. I blinked, disoriented. The man had turned and disappeared the same way. I went back inside, locking the door behind me with a click that felt too loud in the quiet diner. My hands trembled as I sat down, trying to steady my breathing. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, wiped a glass nearby. "Long day?" she asked without looking up. I nodded, unable to speak. My mind raced, piecing together the strange encounter. Who were they? Why had they been watching me? And what did that warning mean? I glanced at the clock on the wall. My bus wasn't due for another hour. Leaving now felt like stepping into a trap, but staying put didn't feel safe either. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the street was slick and empty. The world beyond the diner felt suddenly alien, the normalcy shattered. I forced myself to finish the cold tea, my eyes darting to the window every few seconds. The man and woman were gone, but the unease lingered like an unwanted shadow. When I finally stepped outside again, the street seemed quieter than before. No footsteps, no figures waiting in the mist. Just the faint smell of rain and the distant hum of the city. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew the day's ordinary rhythm had cracked, and something darker was out there, waiting. I thought the slow walk to the bus stop would clear my head. The evening was unremarkable, just a bit chilly with the kind of gray sky that made the streetlights flicker on too early. The neighborhood felt quiet, the usual suburban calm wrapped around the rows of houses like a fog. I had left my shift 15 minutes early, thinking I could catch the 7:03 bus instead of waiting until after 7:30. It was supposed to be a simple shortcut back home, no big deal. The street I took was lined with tall oaks, their branches scraping the cracked pavement and casting long shadows that melted together under the dull amber glow of the street lamps. I noticed the usual things, the cracked mailbox on 42nd, the dog tied up in someone's yard barking low and angry as I passed. I felt the brisk bite of the wind against my neck and pulled my jacket tighter. The air smelled of damp leaves and faint gasoline from a car idling too long at the corner. When I reached the bus stop, there was no one there yet. I stood under the shelter, the plastic roof sticky with grime, watching the street stretch out empty in both directions. The silence felt heavier than usual, the kind of silence that made your ears ring just a little bit. I glanced down at my phone. 20 minutes until the bus arrived. I tilted my head, listening for the distant hum of an engine or the shuffle of feet. Nothing. Then I heard the footsteps. At first, light and hesitant, like someone unsure of their path. I looked up but saw nothing beyond the dim circle of light around the stop. The footsteps came from behind the row of bushes that lined the sidewalk, slow but deliberate. I couldn't see anyone, but the noise didn't feel natural to the quiet night. The soft crunch of gravel and dry leaves was too precise, too close. I held my breath. They stopped. I waited, muscles tight, eyes scanning the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, a figure stepped into the light. A man. Mid-30s, unshaven, wearing a dark hoodie pulled tight over his head. His face was mostly hidden, but his eyes caught the light and locked onto mine like twin dark holes. He didn't say anything. Just stood there, watching me. My heart thudded in my chest. I forced myself to smile, a weak, automatic gesture. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Waiting for the bus too?" He didn't respond. Just tilted his head slightly, like he was sizing me up or deciding something. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. I noticed his hands were shoved deep in his pockets, fingers twitching occasionally. I felt a cold prickle run down my spine. "Look, I'm just trying to get home," I said, stepping a little closer to the shelter. "This is a pretty quiet neighborhood, huh?" Still no answer. He took a step forward, closing the distance. It wasn't aggressive, more like he was testing the space between us, trying to see if I'd flinch or run. My throat tightened, and my fingers curled into fists. I debated turning around and walking back, but the street behind me was darker and less familiar. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, the screen lighting up with a text from my roommate asking if I was on my way. I typed a quick reply. The man's gaze flicked to the phone, then back to me. He cleared his throat, finally speaking in a low, gravelly voice. "You live around here?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to sound steady. "Yeah. Just a few blocks down." He smiled then, a quick flash of teeth that didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if I walk with you? It's a bit late for someone alone." I hesitated. The offer felt less like a courtesy and more like a trap. But the bus was still 15 minutes away, and the thought of standing there with him silently watching was worse. "Okay," I said, managing to keep my voice even. We started walking together down the sidewalk, the sound of our footsteps mixing with the distant hum of cars on the main street. The man kept pace slightly behind me, not too close but close enough that I could feel his presence like a shadow stretching out in front of me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, catching glimpses of his face in the dim light, sharp features, eyes that never quite looked friendly. "Do you work around here?" he asked. "Yeah. Night shift." I kept my answer short, hoping to avoid provoking more questions. He nodded, and for a moment, the silence between us felt less charged. But then he said something that made my stomach twist. "You're out late. Alone. Doesn't seem safe." I wanted to agree, to say maybe I'd made a mistake leaving early. Instead, I forced myself to keep walking, head down, heart pounding. I noticed his stride quicken, the distance between us shrinking. "Where exactly do you live?" he asked. I slowed, pretending to think. "Not far. Just past a park." He stopped beside me, voice dropping almost to a whisper. "That park's empty at night. Perfect place to disappear." I swallowed hard, the image flashing in my mind, the dark trees, the empty benches, the way the shadows swallowed everything beyond the streetlight's reach. I felt a surge of panic, sudden and sharp, but I kept my face calm. "Why do you want to know?" I asked. He shrugged, but there was a strange glint in his eyes. "Just curious. You never know who's watching, right?" I nodded, my skin prickling with unease. The street was nearly empty now, the occasional distant headlights cutting through the gloom, but no one else in sight. My phone buzzed again. I glanced down, an alert from the bus tracker saying it was 5 minutes away. "I should get ready," I said, stepping a little faster. "Thanks for walking with me." He matched my pace, coming closer. "You don't have to thank me." I spotted the bus pulling up at the stop ahead, its headlights bright and welcoming in the dark street. Relief flooded through me. I quickened my steps, breaking into a light jog. The man didn't follow. He stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, watching me run toward the bus like he was letting me go, but his eyes stayed fixed on my retreating back. Once I was safely on the bus, I sank into the seat by the window and exhaled, the warmth from the heater washing over me. I watched the man standing there under the streetlight, the dark hoodie slipping down his shoulders, his face obscured again. The bus pulled away, swallowing the street behind us. For a moment, I thought the danger was over. But the way he'd watched me, the things he'd said, they clung to me like a shadow. I pulled my jacket tighter and stared out at the dark street, knowing that tonight, the quiet had cracked open, and whatever was out there wasn't done watching. The clock on the dashboard glowed 2:14 a.m. in the creeping darkness, the soft hum of the engine the only company I had. I sat in the driver's seat of my old sedan, parked in the gravel lot behind the 24-hour supermarket. My head tilted forward, resting on the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. The fluorescent bulbs above the store flickered erratically, casting a sickly pallor over the cracked pavement. I had told myself I was just making a quick stop to grab some water and snacks before I started the long drive home. But now, as I sat there with my hands clenched tight on the steering wheel, I wasn't so sure. It started small. I noticed a black SUV parked a few spaces over as I pulled in too close to the entrance, like its driver was waiting for someone. It wasn't unusual for late-night trucks or vans to be around, especially on this side of town, but something about it felt off. The windows were tinted, but I could make out a figure inside, sitting still, watching. I told myself the person was probably just another insomniac or a night shift worker killing time. Still, my eyes kept drifting toward the vehicle every few minutes. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The aisles were nearly empty, except for a lone cashier and a teenage kid stocking shelves near the back. I moved quickly, trying not to draw attention. The cold of the water bottles chilled my fingertips through the plastic packaging. I grabbed some protein bars as well, my movements a little too hurried, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. The fluorescent hum seemed louder in the otherwise quiet store. When I glanced at the glass door on my way out, I caught a glimpse of the black SUV's headlights turning on. I froze. Was that driver watching the store's entrance or me? My heart hammered against my ribs like a warning drum. I pushed the cart harder, trying to ignore the feeling that I had just stepped into someone else's trap. The lot was mostly empty now, save for that black SUV. I could see its silhouette distinctly, the tinted windows still obscuring any detail. As I approached my car, I noticed the driver's side door was slightly ajar. That had not been there when I pulled in. I stopped dead in my tracks. The sound of the engine idling grew louder, like a low growl in the stillness. I scanned the lot, but no one else was around. The streetlights lining the road flickered on and off, throwing shadows across the cracked asphalt. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle, hesitating before pulling it shut firmly. I locked the doors and sat back, trying to catch my breath, the keys still in the ignition. The SUV began to move, slowly rolling toward the exit of the lot. A chill crept over me as I watched it turn onto the main road, headlights disappearing into the distance. I waited a few minutes before starting my engine, glancing in the rearview mirror repeatedly. The road home was a winding two-lane stretch through dense woods, the only light from my headlights and the occasional radio tower blinking in the distance. The thought of being followed made my skin crawl. About 10 minutes into the drive, I caught the glint of headlights in my rearview mirror. My heart sank. The black SUV was back, tailing me at a cautious distance. Every twist and turn I made, it followed. I tried to shake it, taking unexpected exits and slowing down near clusters of houses, hoping the vehicle would pass by, but it didn't. I felt trapped, the dark woods pressing in on either side, my only lifeline the thin strip of light in front of me. My phone vibrated on the passenger seat. I ignored it, not wanting to risk distraction. The SUV closed in, the engine's growl low and threatening. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that there could be a rational explanation, maybe someone had made a wrong turn, or it was coincidence. But there was no denying the fear twisting in my stomach. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road ahead. I slammed the brakes, tires screeching on the asphalt. The headlights caught the figure for a split second, a man, mid-30s, wearing a dark hoodie that swallowed his face in shadow. He didn't run, he just stood there, unmoving, as if daring me to proceed. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white. The SUV screeched to a halt behind me, engine idling again. I locked the doors instinctively and took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. The man on the road raised a hand, not in greeting, but in warning, a silent gesture that sent a shiver down my spine. The SUV's driver's door opened slowly, and the figure inside stepped out. I recognized him then. The man in the hoodie was the same person who had been in the SUV. His face was grim, eyes dark and unreadable under the streetlights. He didn't smile. He didn't say a word. The man approached my car, each step deliberate and slow. I stared straight ahead, refusing to meet his gaze. My mind raced. Should I try to drive away, risk hitting him, or stay still and hope he left? The air grew thicker, heavier with dread. He stopped at my window, and for a moment, I thought he might just keep walking. Then he tapped the glass twice with his knuckles. The sound was sharp, insistent. My breath caught in my throat. I shook my head, backing away instinctively, but the man's face was calm, almost eerily composed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled paper, pressing it against the glass before stepping back. With trembling fingers, I unlocked the door just enough to slip the note hand to hand without opening fully. He nodded once and stepped back into the shadows. The SUV's engine roared as it backed away slowly and turned down a side street. I pulled out the slip of paper and read the scrawled message under the flickering streetlight. It said, "We need to talk. Don't go home." I stared at the note, cold sweat beading on my forehead. The woods around me felt suddenly claustrophobic, the shadows deeper and more menacing. I fumbled for my phone, hands still trembling, and dialed 911. The line rang in my ear, but I couldn't bring myself to explain the strange encounter. How could I? It sounded insane. I sat there for what felt like hours, the night pressing down on me, every creak and rustle outside making me jump. The black SUV was gone, but the unease lingered, a heavy weight in my chest. I didn't know who that man was, or what he wanted. All I knew was that whatever was coming next was real, and I wasn't ready for it. Story 5, Whispers Beneath the Forsaken Shelter. I never thought much about the walk home from the bus stop. It was just under a mile, along a stretch of sidewalk that cut through a series of quiet residential streets. The houses were modest, mostly ranch-style or small two-stories, yards neat but unremarkable. I took this route every evening after work. The sun was just dipping below the horizon that Thursday, casting long shadows through the thinning trees lining the street. That day had been long. I'd stayed late at the bookstore to help rearrange the new titles and didn't leave until well after 7. The air had already cooled down, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I stepped off the bus. The streetlights hadn't all flicked on yet, so the neighborhood was dim, the kind of fading light that makes everything look sharper and more out of place. As I started walking, I noticed a man standing near the corner where the street forked. He was leaning against a lamppost, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a dark hoodie. His face was partially hidden by the hood shadow, but I could tell he was watching me. I tried to catch his eye, to see if it was a case of someone just waiting for a ride or something harmless. He didn't look away. I considered crossing the street to avoid him, but the other side was lined with dense bushes, and I didn't want to risk tripping or twisting an ankle in the dark. Instead, I kept my eyes on the path, my pace steady but brisk. The man stayed where he was, not moving, like he was part of the lamppost itself. The crunch of my footsteps on the gravel driveway behind me was loud enough to make me startle. A sudden thought crossed my mind. What if he was waiting for me specifically? That paranoia was silly, right? But my chest tightened, and I found myself glancing back more frequently. When I passed the corner, I took a quick inventory of where other people were. A woman was jogging several blocks ahead, headphones in, moving steadily without noticing anything around her. A couple of kids screamed on their porch, chasing each other with a dog that barked incessantly. Nothing unusual, but the man was no longer in sight. I slowed down, trying to calm my thudding heart. Maybe he had just been waiting for the bus. Maybe he'd turned down a side street. But as I reached the next intersection, I spotted him again. This time he was standing at the edge of someone's driveway, hands still in his pockets, head tilted slightly as if listening. I considered crossing the street again. The streetlights were starting to buzz alive, but it wasn't fully bright yet. A soft wind shuffled the fallen leaves across the pavement, making the quiet feel heavier. The man's presence was becoming a weight pressing against my skin. I glanced behind me again and saw movement, a figure stepping out from behind a large oak tree closer to the park. I blinked. It was a different person, a woman, maybe in her 40s, wearing a long coat and clutching a bag against her side. She, too, looked like she noticed me, but she didn't hurry. Instead, she started walking in my direction. Suddenly the street felt narrower. I quickened my pace, ears straining for any sound, my own breathing, footsteps, the distant hum of traffic. The jogger was now out of sight, and the kids' noises had faded into the evening calm. I pulled out my phone to check the time. 7:22 p.m. Battery was low but enough to call or text if I needed. Just then, a familiar chime rang out, the sound of a message. I glanced at the screen. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "You're being watched." My stomach dropped. I looked around quickly. The man in the hoodie was gone. The woman was still coming toward me, but now her steps were slower, more measured. She didn't pick up speed when I did. I tried to steady my voice and called out, "Hey, do I know you?" No response. Her eyes were fixed on me, unreadable. I passed a narrow alley between two houses and hesitated. The woman was now about 20 feet behind me. I thought about turning down the alley to lose her, but something was wrong about that too. It was too dark, too silent, and if she wanted to follow, I'd be trapped. Instead, I decided to keep moving forward. My phone vibrated again. Another message, "Stop looking back." I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. My mind raced through every safety tip I'd ever heard. Don't talk to strangers, stay in well-lit areas, keep your phone handy. But none of it mattered if the stranger following me wasn't going to respond to reason. I spotted a porch light flick on up ahead, and a man inside the house looked out through the window. I debated calling out, but my voice caught in my throat. What if he didn't hear me? Or worse, what if no one could do anything? The woman slowed down and stopped, her coat brushing the sidewalk. She pulled something out of her bag, a dark object that glinted faintly in the streetlight. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a phone or something else? I couldn't tell. I spun around and broke into a run, heart hammering in my chest, feet pounding against the cracked pavement. The woman called out something, but I didn't stop. By the time I burst through the gate of my own yard and slammed the door behind me, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. I peeked out the window, but the street was empty again. No sign of her. No sign of the man in the hoodie. I sat down, back against the door, phone still trembling in my hand. The messages had stopped. I debated calling the police but hesitated. What if it were all a coincidence? What if I was just overreacting? But then I noticed my front porch light was flickering, and when I looked out toward the street again, I saw a shadow move behind the bushes across from my house. Something about the way it lingered made me realize this wasn't over. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind was a whisper just outside the window. Somewhere in the dark, someone was watching. It was a Thursday evening when I first noticed him. I'd just finished my shift at the diner down on Maple Street, the late-night crowd having finally thinned out after the usual Friday and Saturday chaos. Thursday nights were slower, quieter, and I usually enjoyed the solitude on the drive home, just me, the dark road, and my playlist cycling through podcasts and old jazz records. That night, the streetlights flickered as I pulled onto the highway, the rain having just stopped, leaving everything slick and reflective under the amber glow. I thought nothing of it at first. The car behind me kept pace, a little too close, tail lights glaring red in my rearview mirror. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting it to be someone just in a hurry, but something about the way the vehicle stayed there, matching every turn and brake, felt deliberate. I tapped the brakes lightly, and it followed suit. I switched lanes, and it did the same. My heart quickened, but I told myself to calm down. Maybe it was just coincidence. The road curved sharply ahead, a narrow stretch surrounded by thick pines that blocked the weak moonlight. There was no one around, no houses or street lamps, just dark trees looming on either side like silent sentinels. I glanced back again. The car was still there, its headlights bright and steady, no attempt to pass. I pulled onto a small turnout, a gravel patch meant for maintenance vehicles, and stopped. The car pulled over behind me, engine idling softly. I sat frozen for a moment, my breath catching in the chilly air, the silence pressing in like a weight. The driver's side window of the other car rolled down slowly. A man's face appeared in the dim light, late 30s, scruffy beard, eyes that didn't quite meet mine. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made your skin crawl, too wide, too forced. "Hey there," he said, voice low and smooth, like he'd practiced this line before. "Lost or something?" I shook my head, my voice barely more than a whisper. "No. Just waiting a minute." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Right. Well, you shouldn't be out here alone. Not safe." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Thanks for the concern," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "I'm fine." He leaned closer, the shadows playing over his face, making his features sharper, more menacing. "Look, if you need a ride, I'm headed towards town. Could drop you off." Something in his eyes made me step back. "No, really, I've got a car. I'm fine." After a moment, he shut the window and started his engine. The car pulled forward slowly and merged back onto the highway, the tail lights disappearing into the night. I sat there a long time, hands trembling on the steering wheel, until I finally forced myself to drive the rest of the way home, glancing in the mirror every few seconds. The next few days were uneventful, or at least that's how I tried to convince myself. I kept my phone close, double-locking my front door, and avoided stopping at the gas station on the highway where I'd first seen the man. But the sense of being watched didn't leave me. At work, I caught glimpses of a figure standing just beyond the parking lot's light, or someone sitting too long in the booth across from the kitchen window. Each time I looked up, they disappeared. One night, after my shift, I took a different route home, winding through side streets instead of the highway. The rain had started again, tapping softly on my windshield as I drove slowly beneath dripping maples and street lamps that cast pools of yellow light onto the wet pavement. I thought I was safe, but then I saw the man again, standing at the corner of an empty intersection, his coat pulled tight against the rain, staring directly at me. I stopped the car, heart pounding. He didn't move. His eyes caught mine through the blurred glass, and for a second, I swore I saw a flicker of something, anger, sadism, before he turned and disappeared into the darkness. That night, sleep came in fits and starts, my dreams haunted by shadows and footsteps approaching just out of sight. I kept the blinds closed, the locks engaged, but the feeling of being trapped inside my own home grew heavier with every passing hour. A few nights later, I was sitting in my living room, the only light coming from the muted glow of the television. It was just past midnight, and the house was silent except for the hum of the heater and the distant sound of rain hitting the roof. I was scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself when I heard a faint tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate taps. My breath caught. I stood and moved cautiously toward the window, pulling back the curtain just a crack. There he was, standing outside, drenched and pale, watching me. His eyes were fixed on mine, and the smile was gone, replaced by a cold, unreadable expression. I slammed the curtain shut and backed away, my hands shaking violently. I locked every door and window again, checked the back door, the garage, the basement, all secure. I called a friend, left a message explaining what had happened, and then sat in the dark, clutching a baseball bat I kept under the couch for emergencies. Hours later, when the morning light finally pushed through the curtains, I went outside to check. The grass was wet, the pavement slick. There were faint footprints in the dirt near the side window, too small and shallow to be sure, but unmistakably human. I reported the incident to the police, who promised to increase patrols in the area, but no one came by for days. Meanwhile, the man's shadow seemed to cling to every corner of my life, an ever-present reminder that the danger was real and close. I started carrying pepper spray and changed my routine, never driving the same way twice, checking over my shoulder constantly. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for me, patient, persistent, watching. One night, the power went out for nearly an hour. I was alone, candles flickering, heart pounding in the oppressive silence. And then, just as I was about to call the police, I heard the faintest sound, a slow, measured knock at the front door. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat in the dark, bat in hand, listening as the knock came again, then stopped. Whatever happened next, I knew this was just the beginning. The ordinary days I'd taken for granted, the commute, the quiet evenings, had been ripped away, replaced by a growing terror I couldn't escape. And I was running out of time. The bus was late. I knew this as I stood on the cracked concrete slab with a handful of other people huddled under an ancient bus stop shelter on the edge of town, the sun dipping behind the rows of boxy apartment blocks that lined the street. The air smelled of wet asphalt and roasting chestnuts from a street vendor's cart that had set up a few feet away. It was a cold evening, but not freezing, just enough to make my breath fog with every exhale. I checked my phone again. No signal. Dead battery. I'd forgotten my charger at the office, and this was the price for neglect. Normally, I wouldn't worry. The bus usually came on time. But today, the delay gnawed at me. I had no idea why. The streetlights were flickering on as the sky darkened to a bruised purple, and the clouds were thick. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked in the distance, sharp and sudden. The other people waiting at the shelter were scattered, quiet, their faces half lit by the dull glow of the street lamps. A middle-aged woman in a thick coat kept adjusting the strap on her handbag, her eyes darting toward the road every few seconds. A younger man leaned against the shelter's side, scrolling on his phone, his expression blank. None of them seemed to acknowledge each other. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, expectant. I glanced down the street. No lights from the bus in sight. The wind stirred the dry leaves along the gutter, sending them swirling in little eddies. My hands were shoved deep into my jacket pockets, but the cold was creeping in, gnawing at the tips of my fingers. I tried to shake off the creeping unease that had settled in my chest. Maybe the bus had been delayed by traffic. Maybe an accident up ahead. But then again, why didn't the bus company send any alerts? The thought pushed me to look around more carefully. I noticed a car parked a little way down, half hidden in the shadow of a tree. It was an older model sedan, dark blue, I thought, with tinted windows. The car's engine was off, but it was there, sitting still like a watchful predator. I tried to dismiss it as someone waiting for a friend or a family member, but something felt off. The driver's side window was cracked down just a few inches, and I thought I saw a figure inside, slumped low, face obscured. A shiver ran down my spine. I glanced away, focusing on the street ahead. The bus still hadn't come, and the woman nearby muttered something under her breath, clutching her bag tighter. The younger man shifted his weight and looked up from his phone, scanning the street, then back down. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from the far end of the street. There was no one else around, no buildings with entrances on that side, just the street and a patch of overgrown grass leading to the old train tracks. The footsteps were uneven, like someone dragging their feet. I turned, trying to catch sight of whoever it was. The streetlights cast long, wavering shadows, and as the figure moved closer, I saw a man in a dark hoodie, his face obscured but his posture tense. He didn't hurry, just kept coming, step by step, like he was waiting for something or someone. My heart sped up. The woman next to me had stopped muttering and was now staring at the approaching figure. The younger man straightened, slipping his phone into his pocket. As the man neared the bus shelter, I noticed something in his hands, a long metal object, thin and straight, tucked under his arm like a cane, but it gleamed faintly in the streetlight. I couldn't tell what it was. He stopped about 10 feet away from us, standing in the shadow between two lampposts. His head tilted slightly, as if surveying us. He said nothing. The woman next to me clutched her bag tighter, and I realized she was trembling. I wanted to say something, ask if she was okay, but my voice was stuck in my throat. The man in the hoodie shifted his weight, the metal object gleaming again. The younger man took a step back, and I moved closer to the shelter's edge, my eyes locked on the stranger. Without warning, the man took a step forward. The woman gasped softly and began backing away. I was frozen, unsure what to do. Then, the bus's headlights rounded the corner, flooding the street with bright light. The man in the hoodie stiffened, then turned and disappeared into the growing darkness behind the trees. Everyone exhaled, some releasing the breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. The woman wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed. The younger man and I exchanged a glance, equal parts relief and lingering unease. The bus pulled up slowly, squealing slightly as it stopped. The driver avoided eye contact as we boarded. I took a seat near the back, my hands still shaking. Outside, the dark blue sedan was gone. The ride home felt longer than usual, the streetlights blurring past in a rhythm that did little to calm my nerves. I kept replaying the man's slow approach, the gleam of the metal object, the way he had watched us without a word. When I finally reached my stop and stepped off into the night, the streets were empty, the apartment silent. I double-checked my pockets for my keys, then hurried inside, locking the door behind me. Safe, for now. But the feeling settled deep in my gut. This wasn't over. The evening had started out ordinary enough. After a long day at the diner, I grabbed a coffee from the vending machine outside the back entrance, the kind of oversweetened, lukewarm stuff I usually avoided but needed then more than anything. The sun had just dipped behind the strip mall roof, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt parking lot. The air smelled damp, like rain had been promised but never came. I stepped into my car, the driver's seat still warm from the sun, and took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. My phone buzzed, a text from Jason, checking in about the sound system for the weekend gig. I thumbed out a quick reply and started the engine. The quiet hum was comforting after the clatter of the kitchen. The plan was simple. Drive home, eat something, maybe catch a couple hours of sleep before the night shift at the warehouse. But even on nights like this, things could go sideways. The street lights flickered as I pulled out onto the main road. I made a right and headed down toward the residential area where my apartment was. The streets were empty, the kind of quiet that felt like it could be broken at any moment but hadn't yet. I passed the corner store, its flickering neon sign buzzing overhead, and noticed a man standing just past the cycle racks. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, hands shoved deep inside the pockets. Usually, that wouldn't mean much. People loitered after hours all the time. But something about the way he stood, too still, too watchful, made my skin crawl. He didn't look like he was waiting for a ride or a friend. His eyes, barely visible beneath the hood, locked onto me as I rolled past. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of him retreating into the shadows between the stores. I shook my head, telling myself I was just tired and jumpy. It was probably some kid trying to scare off potential shoplifters or just waiting for a cigarette. I turned onto my street, the houses lined up like silent sentinels, their windows dark. The walk from the parking spot to my apartment wasn't far, but it was enough to make me feel exposed. I kept my keys in my hand, the cold metal a small reassurance. Just as I unlocked the door, I heard footsteps behind me, quick, uneven, like someone trying not to be heard. I stopped, heart pounding. For a moment, nothing. Then the footsteps slowed, stopped altogether. I turned sharply, shining my phone's flashlight toward the end of the walkway. No one there. Just the empty sidewalk and the same cracked concrete slabs I'd seen 1,000 times. Inside, I locked the door and slid the deadbolt home, peering through the peephole. The street was deserted except for a black car parked a few houses down. Its windows were tinted too dark to see inside. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe that guy from the store had followed me, but maybe he hadn't. Maybe the car belonged to a neighbor. Maybe nothing was wrong at all. The apartment was cold, the heater still broken after the landlord promised to fix it next week. I wrapped myself in a threadbare blanket and sat on the couch. The TV flickered silently, muted. I stared out the window, watching the black car remain parked, unmoving. Then my phone vibrated again. A message from an unknown number, "You're almost home." I swallowed hard, the room suddenly too small. I checked the locks again. The car lights flicked on, cutting through the window like shards of white-hot ice. The engine revved softly, then died. I called Jason, hands trembling, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message, trying to keep my voice steady, telling him where I was and what was happening. The black car started moving, creeping closer down the street. I could hear the tires crunch on gravel that wasn't there before. The footsteps came back, this time closer, faster, just outside the building. The doormat shifted as if someone was brushing dirt off their shoes. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the door, a relic from better days, and sat in the dark, listening. The footsteps stopped right beneath the window. Then a scratch, like fingernails dragged across wood. My breath caught. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft, deliberate knocking. 3 times. I counted. Then silence. Minutes passed, the kind that feel like hours. I didn't dare move. When I finally summoned the courage to peek through the curtains, the street was empty again. The black car was gone. I called the police, my voice barely above a whisper. They said they'd send someone by in a patrol car, but with the late hour, it might be a while. I told them about the message, the car, the knocking. They advised me to stay inside, lock every door and window, and avoid answering if anyone came to the door. I spent the rest of the night watching the street, bat in hand, ears straining for the slightest sound. The hours blurred together, an endless loop of silence, broken only by the occasional passing vehicle. When morning came, the first light felt less like relief and more like an invitation for whatever was out there to come back. But for now, the threat had receded, at least for a moment. The rain started just as I stepped out of the station, a slow drizzle that quickly thickened into something heavier, cold enough to seep through the thin jacket I'd thrown on in a hurry. The platform was nearly deserted, only a few late commuters lingered under the flickering shelter lights, faces half hidden by umbrellas or collars. I pulled my backpack tighter, feeling the weight of the day's unease settle deeper in my chest. I'd been trying to shake the feeling for hours now, that prickling awareness you get when something's off but you can't put your finger on it. It began that afternoon when I noticed the same man sitting on the bench across the street from my office, alone, reading a newspaper. I figured it was coincidence until I saw him again outside the coffee shop, then once more walking behind me to the grocery store. Each time, he kept his distance, but he never broke eye contact. When I slowed down or crossed the street, he mirrored my movements, just far enough away to feel like fate rather than threat. But I knew better. Now, walking home through the slick streets, the rain muffled most sounds except the occasional car splashing through puddles and the dull hum of street lamps. I was almost at the corner where the neighborhood thinned out, and the street lights grew patchy, when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, measured, matching my pace. I glanced over my shoulder but saw only the blur of shadows and umbrellas bundled against the rain. The scent of wet pavement mixed with exhaust fumes filled my nostrils, but there was something else too, a faint, lingering smell like tobacco smoke, sharp and acrid against the cool dampness. I tried to focus on the rhythm of my footsteps, forcing my mind back to the mundane, groceries waiting in the fridge, a text from my sister, the weekend plans I'd been looking forward to. But the footsteps persisted, steady and unyielding. When I reached the dim triangle of light beneath the street lamp, I dared a longer look. A figure stood just beyond the light's edge, face hidden beneath a soaked hood, hands stuffed in the pockets of a dark coat. My heart knocked hard against my ribs, but part of me told me to keep moving, to pretend I hadn't noticed. I crossed the street quickly, my boots splashing through a shallow puddle, and the footsteps accelerated just a little. I didn't dare run, I was too far from the main roads, and all those empty houses behind me had no one to call out to. The wet air closed in, thick with the sound of rain hitting the sidewalk and the distant whistle of a train. I thought about ducking into the convenience store on the corner, but it was closed. The yellow closed sign clung to the door, empty inside except for a few stray newspapers and an overhead light flickering like a dying eye. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Just the spinning wheel of waiting, like the universe mocking me. I stuffed it away and kept walking, now clutching my bag strap like a lifeline, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The street twisted here, tree branches arching overhead, their leaves dripping water that splattered on my face. Somewhere behind me, a car door slammed. I paused, heart hammering, but the street was empty when I looked back. At the next corner, a narrow alley opened between two rows of boarded-up storefronts. I shivered, debating whether to cross or try to skirt around. Then I saw the figure again, standing at the alley's mouth, just beneath a broken street lamp that buzzed in the damp air. I stopped dead. His hood was down, and I saw the face, pale, thin, eyes like cold glass reflecting the orange streetlight. There was no smile, no expression except an unreadable blank. He said nothing. I forced my voice past the lump in my throat. "Do you need something?" No answer. Just a slow step forward. The rain pelted down harder, and I could feel it soaking through my clothes, chilling my skin. "I'm just heading home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though I felt my hands tremble against the cold zipper of my jacket. "Please, I don't want any trouble." He took another step, then another, narrowing the distance between us. I weighed my options in the moment it took him to close the space, run and risk tripping on the wet pavement, or keep talking and hope to stall. I chose words, fumbling with the lock on my backpack for anything that could be a weapon. "What's your name?" I asked. He stopped, tilting his head slightly as if considering whether to answer. Then, in a voice low and dry like gravel, he said, "You don't get to ask." From the shadows behind him, I caught movement, a second figure, this one shorter, bulkier, stepping out from between the buildings. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming to move. "I want to keep it simple," the first man said, voice almost conversational now. "No games." You come with us. Quiet. There was no time to argue. My breath caught, lungs tightening as my heart beat an erratic drum in my ears. I backed up slowly, eyes flicking to the second man who was closing in, face obscured beneath an old baseball cap pulled low. Look, I said, voice breaking, I'm not who you think I am. Please. The rain sluiced down harder, drumming on the pavement, soaking my hair and running down my face. I could hear the faint scrape of the second man's shoes on the concrete, the shallow intake of breath from the first. The street around us felt impossibly narrow, suffocating. Then, like a sudden crack in the tension, the sharp scream of a siren in the distance. Both men froze, exchanging a quick glance. The first's eyes darted toward the street where the siren sounded, then back to me. You're lucky this time, he said quietly. Without another word, they turned and melted back into the maze of alleys, swallowed by the darkness and rain. I stood still, chest heaving, the wet cold bleeding into my skin. The siren grew louder, then faded again into the night. I didn't move until the last echoes disappeared, then ran to the main road where a few cars passed by, their headlights cutting through the curtain of rain. At my apartment door, hands shaking, I double-locked it and pressed my ear to the wood. The rain was a steady roar outside, but inside was thick silence. I sank against the door, trying to catch my breath. The memory of those glassy eyes burned behind my eyelids. I didn't know what they wanted. I didn't know if they'd come back. But I knew I wasn't safe, not anywhere I thought I was. And that was the thing that terrified me most. Story 6, Whispers Beneath the Isolated Cabin. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I noticed it. The old red pickup truck parked just across the street from my apartment building. I lived on the third floor, so the street wasn't usually the first thing on my mind in the mornings, especially not on a Sunday, when the city felt quieter and the usual hum of cars and pedestrians slowed to a trickle. But there it was, sitting on the cracked asphalt, the paint faded and peeling like it hadn't seen a proper wash in years. The truck wasn't unusual by itself, there were plenty of old vehicles scattered around the neighborhood, but I'd never seen it before. Not in the 6 months I'd lived here. I glanced away, convincing myself I was overthinking it. Maybe it belonged to one of the neighbors who was out early. The sun was just peeking over the rooftops, casting long shadows that stretched down the street. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was clear. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and leaned out the window, curious but telling myself not to get distracted. I had a long day ahead, papers to grade, emails to answer, and a grocery run planned before the evening. When I looked again, the truck's engine was running. The driver's side window was rolled down, and a man was sitting behind the wheel. I couldn't make out his face clearly, the morning light hit him just wrong, leaving his features in shadow. He didn't move, just sat there, staring straight ahead like he was waiting for something or someone. For a moment, my stomach tightened, a vague but persistent unease curling inside me. My first thought was to believe it was nothing. People waited in cars all the time. But then I noticed the passenger door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. No one was getting in or out. No one around except that man in the truck. I pulled my head back inside and locked the window. The truck stayed there for nearly an hour. I caught glimpses of it between doing stretches and washing dishes, always stationary, always running, always that same figure behind the wheel. My phone buzzed with a text from my friend Jenna, asking if I wanted to meet for lunch. I typed back a quick yes, grabbing my keys and stepping out just as the truck's engine finally cut off. Outside, the street was quieter now. The man was gone, but the door of the truck remained wide open, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated. Should I close it? Or call the police? But it felt strange to raise a fuss over an abandoned vehicle. Maybe the driver had left it to grab something nearby. I shut the door carefully and locked it, glancing around. No one was watching. No one was following. Just the occasional distant bark of a dog and the steady hum of the city waking up. I shoved the image out of my mind and headed down the block. The grocery store wasn't far, and the fresh air helped clear the tightness in my chest that was growing without reason. On the way, I passed a man sitting on a bench near the small park at the corner. He looked up as I walked by, eyes dark and unblinking beneath a baseball cap pulled low. I returned his gaze for a moment longer than I intended, feeling the weight of it settle in my gut. Then I looked away quickly, telling myself I was just paranoid. Inside the store, the usual fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I grabbed a basket. I moved down the aisles, filling it with the things I needed: milk, eggs, bread, some fresh fruit. When I reached the back corner, near the cleaning supplies, I heard footsteps behind me. Not the usual shuffle of other shoppers, but deliberate, close, almost matching my pace. I quickened my steps slightly, my breath hitching. I told myself it was just another shopper, someone finishing their list. I glanced back, but the aisles were crowded, and I couldn't see more than a blur of movement and colors. By the time I reached the checkout line, I was sweating under my jacket, hands trembling enough that I dropped a carton of orange juice. The cashier gave me a look, but said nothing as I hurriedly paid and left. Outside, the sun was higher, warmer now, but the shadows seemed darker, longer. I took a deep breath, feeling a wild urge to get home, to lock every door and window. As I walked back, I noticed the red truck again, parked at the far end of the block this time. The driver's seat was empty, but the door was wide open again. My heart pounded. It wasn't just odd anymore, it was deliberate. Someone was watching. Someone was waiting. I crossed the street quickly, keeping my eyes on the parked car as I passed. There was no one inside, no sign of the man from before. But as I rounded the corner toward my building, I caught the sound of footsteps behind me again, this time closer, faster. My steps faltered. I glanced back, catching a glimpse of a figure disappearing into a narrow alleyway between two storefronts. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I wanted to call out, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the pavement. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just someone taking a shortcut, someone who didn't mean harm. But the stories I heard, the warnings on neighborhood message boards about break-ins and assaults, all crowded into my head. I unlocked the front door of my building and slipped inside, heart hammering. The lobby was empty, the silence thick and heavy. I pressed the button for the elevator, waiting anxiously as the doors slid open with a ding. I stepped in, and the doors closed behind me with a finality that felt like a lock clicking shut. On the ride up, I stared at my reflection in the polished metal walls, wide eyes, pale face, trembling hands. When the doors opened, I hurried into the hallway, locked my door behind me, and double-checked it. Then, sitting on the floor with my back against the door, I tried to slow my breathing. I didn't know who the man in the truck was. I didn't know if the footsteps behind me had been a coincidence or something worse. All I knew was that in the space of a few hours, my quiet, ordinary Sunday had turned into something unshakable and wrong. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent to the quiet terror settling into the corners of my apartment. I sat there in the fading morning light, trying to make sense of the fear that had found me, and wondering what would come next. The bus stopped at the edge of town just after 7 in the evening, the streetlights flickering on one by one as the sun sank behind the low hills. I stepped down onto the cracked pavement, the cold air pressing in on me heavier than it had all day. My phone was nearly dead, and the battery saver warning blinked in orange. I glanced around the empty street, the only sounds the distant rumble of a freight train and the soft hum of the bus engine winding down behind me. I had taken this route so many times before, the slow, looping bus from the city back to my parents' house in the suburbs, but today something was off. It was the kind of off you notice without immediately knowing why, like a quiet hum just beneath the usual noise. The streets were quieter than usual. Fewer cars. No kids playing in front yards. Even the wind felt muffled, as if the neighborhood was holding its breath. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking toward the main road, where my parents' house was a 10-minute walk from the bus stop. The sky was now a deep indigo, sprinkled with early stars. Streetlights cast long shadows, and the windows of houses glowed warmly with yellow light. I liked this walk, usually. It gave me time to think after a long day of work. But tonight, I kept looking over my shoulder, heart tightening with each glance. There was a man standing near the corner store, the small grocery that closed at 6 but still illuminated inside with a flickering fluorescent bulb. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. I passed the store quickly, trying not to stare, but when I was a few feet beyond, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, even. My pace quickened, but so did theirs. At first, I told myself it was just another person walking the same way, nothing unusual. But the street was empty beside us, and the sound of those steps was too deliberate, too steady. I glanced back again and caught a glimpse of the hoodie man turning his head toward me. His face was mostly shadowed, but I saw sharp eyes, watchful, cold. I tried to ignore it and pushed my pace faster, the uneven pavement scraping against my cheap sneakers. My phone's screen flickered as I unlocked it to call my parents, fingers trembling slightly. No signal. I cursed under my breath and stuffed the phone back into my coat pocket. The battery was dying anyway. I was alone, and the street was too deserted. The man's footsteps grew louder, matching mine. I could hear the scrape of his shoes on the concrete, and the rustle of fabric with every step. I glanced around for a place to duck into, but the houses were all set back behind small lawns fenced in by low hedges. The corner store was locked up tight, the metal shutter pulled down halfway. No open businesses, no places to hide or yell for help. I reached the intersection where the sidewalk ended. Beyond it was a narrow alley between two houses, the kind of place where the streetlight didn't quite reach. I hesitated, then turned sharply into it, hoping to lose him. The alley was strewn with garbage bins, empty bottles, and a stray cat that darted away as I moved past. The air smelled faintly of rot and old cigarette smoke. The man followed. I heard him step into the alley behind me, his breathing quieter now but steady. I kept going, heart hammering in my chest, every muscle tensed and ready to run. I thought about how stupid I was. Why did I think I could outpace someone who was clearly following me? My breath came in short bursts, forming cold clouds in the night. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder hard and spun me around. I stumbled, eyes wide with terror, staring into the shadowed face of the man from the hoodie. "Hey," he said, voice low and calm, the kind of calm that makes your skin crawl. "You dropped this." He held out my phone, the cracked screen glowing dimly in his palm. I blinked, confused. I hadn't noticed losing it, but relief washed over me before suspicion caught up again. The sudden closeness, the way he held my phone as if it were a prize. I swallowed, trying to steady my voice. "Thanks. I didn't realize." "Yeah." He took a step closer, and I could smell the faint scent of sweat and cheap cologne. "You shouldn't be out here alone so late." I forced a smile, backing away slowly. "It's not far. I'm almost home." He nodded, still watching me closely. "Right. Well, better safe than sorry. I'm just heading back myself." The alley was narrow, and I felt trapped between the two houses, no easy way to escape if he changed his mind. My fingers brushed against my coat pocket, where I kept my keys. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I'm fine, really. Thanks for the phone." He didn't move, just stared for a moment longer, then shrugged and turned back toward the street. His footsteps echoed away slowly. I waited until I heard the crunch of gravel behind a corner, then sprinted the rest of the way home. When I pushed open the front door, the familiar creak felt like a relief. The warmth of the house wrapped around me, but I was shaking. I locked the door behind me, bolted the deadbolt, and leaned against it, heart pounding so loud I thought the neighbors might hear. I kept thinking about the man, how calm he was, how easily he could have done something worse. There was no way to know if it was random, if he was just a creep with nothing better to do, or if he had been watching me all day. The thought of being followed, cornered like that, made my skin crawl. I checked the windows and doors again, pulling the curtains tight. The phone in my hand found its charger, but the screen stayed dark. I sat on the couch, pulling my knees to my chest. Outside, the streetlights blinked on and off, throwing the shadows of the trees against the window. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then went silent. The quiet felt heavy now, like it was waiting for something to happen. I told myself I was safe. For now. But I wasn't sure for how long. When I left the office that night, the sky was already velvet black, and the streetlights along 14th Avenue glowed sickly orange through a thick layer of early autumn fog. I had gotten caught up late finishing some reports and was the last person in the building. Usually, I took the subway home, but after hearing about a couple of muggings near the station recently, I decided to walk the few blocks up to my car instead. I told myself it was an extra precaution. It was only a 10-minute walk, and the neighborhood wasn't exactly dangerous, at least not in the broad daylight. As I stepped out onto the street, the fog felt heavier than I expected, curling around my ankles and dampening the city noise until everything seemed muffled and distant. I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking briskly, the click of my shoes on the sidewalk echoing in the quiet. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of the street lamp's glow on the corner of 15th and Maple. The shape was hunched, maybe a person waiting for a bus, but it was too dark to tell. I blinked, and it was gone. I shook off the unease and kept moving. The air smelled like wood leaves and exhaust fumes, a heavy mix that felt sticky against my skin. My breath came out in little white puffs, even though the air wasn't that cold yet. The street was almost empty except for the occasional car rolling by with its headlights cutting through the fog like searchlights. I tried to focus on the mundane sound of my footsteps, the hum of distant traffic, the faint chime of a late-night diner sign buzzing somewhere ahead. A few blocks down, I noticed a man walking behind me. I didn't turn around at first. It was common to have others on the street, even this late, but something about the way he moved made me tense up. He wasn't keeping pace, he was slower, shuffling with a kind of looseland awkwardness. His silhouette looked a little too bulky for the pitch black of his hoodie, like he was carrying something heavy under it. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was irrational to be scared of a stranger just because it was late. Besides, I wasn't alone. There were streetlights every half block, and a few apartments had their windows lit up. I could see into one on the third floor where a woman was reading on her couch, a small lamp casting a warm glow over her face. Normal people lived here. Nothing bad happened here. Still, the feeling of being watched stretched in my chest, tightening like a noose. I glanced back once, just a quick flick of the eyes, and the man was there, maybe 20 feet behind, his head tilted down as he looked at the cracks between the sidewalk slabs. He didn't look up. The hood shadowed his face, but I could see the faint glint of something metallic hanging from a chain around his neck, catching what little light there was. I tried to focus on my breathing, telling myself to relax, but my heart was pounding in my ears. I was almost at my car now, parked under a blinking street lamp that buzzed and sputtered. The lot was half empty, and the faint outline of my sedan was visible through the fog. As I reached the edge of the lot, I heard footsteps behind me again, but now they were quicker, smaller, and irregular, almost like a limp. I turned sharply, the beam from my phone's flashlight cutting through the mist. No one there. Just the empty street and the rustling of leaves caught in the gutter. I felt a sudden prickling on the back of my neck, that instinctive warning that something was wrong. I unlocked my car and slid in quickly, locking all the doors before taking a breath. Outside, the fog was swirling, and I could just make out the figure standing across the street, not moving, but watching. My hand shook as I started the engine, peering through the windshield, but as soon as the car came to life, the man disappeared into the fog. I sat there for a moment, listening to the engine hum and the faint sounds of the city night. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the man was just out for a walk. Maybe I'd imagined a limp and the way he seemed to vanish. I pulled out of the lot and headed toward the highway entrance, but even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, the headlights of another car showed up briefly behind me, always just far enough back not to be threatening, but close enough to be unnerving. The car never changed lanes or passed me, just shadowed my every move. I tried taking side streets, looping around blocks to lose the tail, but each time I circled back to the highway on-ramp, the same headlights reappeared. My heart throbbed painfully in my chest, sweat slicking my palms on the steering wheel. I knew I should call the police, but I didn't want to seem paranoid if it was nothing. Still, that nagging fear had settled deep and cold. Eventually, I took the exit toward my neighborhood, hoping to find some relief in the familiarity of home. The street was quiet, the houses dark except for a few faint porch lights. As I slowed down, the car behind me brake-checked me by slamming on its brakes until I nearly hit the bumper. My heart leapt into my throat, and I slammed on my brakes, skidding slightly on the wet pavement. The car flashed its high beams, then sped off into the night. My hands grasped the wheel tightly. I sat frozen for a moment, listening to the silence that fell afterward, my breath ragged and shallow. I didn't know who that driver was or why they were following me, but now there was no denying it. I was being hunted. Maybe not in some grand, sinister plot, but something about the calculated way they had tailed me felt predatory, like a cat stalking its prey. My phone was sitting on the passenger seat, and I finally had the courage to call Mom. Hearing her voice, warm and worried, was a small comfort in the otherwise cold and hostile dark. By the time I got into my apartment, double-locked the door, and slid the deadbolt into place, the adrenaline started to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. But even inside, safe behind reinforced locks, I could still hear the echo of those footsteps and the flash of headlights outside my window. The sense of being watched didn't disappear. It just shifted, waiting for the next moment I let my guard down. I didn't know what this was going to become, but I had a sinking feeling it wasn't over yet. I never thought waiting for a bus after midnight could feel so vulnerable. The street lamp above the bench buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow that flickered in the humid air. The summer heat hadn't broken, and the damp smell of recently cut grass mixed with the faint scent of exhaust from the nearby highway. I checked my phone again, no signal. The screen was dead, even though I'd just plugged it in at the diner where I'd worked an overnight shift. I'd gone to the public payphone, but it was smashed, probably out of service for months. Nothing to call for a ride. Nothing but the empty street stretching in both directions. I sat hunched on the bench, trying not to look around too much, but something about the quiet was wrong. Usually, there were a few cars passing by at this hour, or the distant wail of sirens, but tonight it was silent except for the low hum of the street lamp and my own uneven breathing. The bus was supposed to come in 15 minutes, but the schedule had been inconsistent lately, and I didn't dare trust it. I thought I heard footsteps on the cracked pavement behind me. My heart jumped, and I turned quickly, but no one was there, just a long, empty stretch of sidewalk. I told myself it was probably a stray dog or a raccoon, but the sound had been too deliberate, too measured. My eyes adjusted to the shadows beneath the trees that lined the street, but I saw nothing moving except the faint sway of branches in the still air. I tried calling my mom again, hoping she might pick up on her landline, but silence answered. No click, no ring, just a dull hum from the receiver. My instincts told me to get out of there, to move, but my feet felt heavy, rooted like the tree trunk beside me. Then I heard a voice, low and calm, calling from the darkness. Hey! It was close enough that I couldn't ignore it, but far enough away that I couldn't see the speaker. I froze. Are you okay? The voice asked, calm but with an edge I couldn't place. I swallowed hard. Yeah, I'm fine. Just waiting for the boss. There was a silence, then the footsteps again, slower this time, approaching from the side street. I turned fully and saw a man step under the streetlight, his face partially shadowed by the hood of his sweatshirt. He looked around 30, maybe a little older, with sharp eyes that didn't quite meet mine. You look like you could use a ride, he said, voice soft but firm. I shook my head, backing up slightly. No, thanks. The bus is coming. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Buses don't run on time out here. You don't want to be waiting alone all night. I glanced down the street. The bus stop on the other end was empty, and the road was deserted except for the two of us. My pulse quickened. I'm okay, I repeated, forcing calm into my voice. He stepped closer, and I noticed a faint smell of cigarettes and something else metallic, like blood or oil. I could see the knuckles of his right hand were scraped and red, fresh wounds that looked painful. Listen, he said, voice dropping an octave, it's dangerous to be alone here after dark. You really should come with me. Something in his tone triggered an alarm deep in my gut. I shook my head more firmly and stood up, clutching the strap of my bag tight. No, thanks. I'm fine. He didn't move, just watched me, his eyes narrowing. You sure about that? The street lamp flickered again, and I saw him reach slowly into his pocket. My heart slammed in my chest. I took a step back, then another, eyes darting for a way out. The side street was narrow, lined with tight fences and locked gates. The main road was behind me, but no other people were around. Look, I'm not looking for trouble, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Just leave me alone. He smiled again, but this time it was cold and humorless. Trouble's a matter of perspective. I realized he wasn't going to just walk away. The air felt thick and suffocating. My mind raced, looking for options. Then I heard a car approaching from the main road, the distant rumble of an engine growing louder. I turned toward the sound, relief flooding me. The man's face twisted briefly. He looked toward the road, then back at me, his eyes hardening. You play nice, and maybe I'll let you go when your ride gets here. My throat tightened. I squeezed my bag strap, trying to stay as calm as possible. The car's headlights appeared around the corner, an old sedan, moving slowly. Stay right here, I said quickly, more to myself than to him. The man didn't respond. As the car pulled up beside the bench, I saw a woman behind the wheel, waving at me urgently. I nodded, grateful for the distraction. Get in, she called out through the window. I didn't hesitate. The man took a step toward me, but the woman rolled down her window wider and shouted, "Hey! Back off!" The man hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the shadows of the side street. My legs felt shaky as I slid into the passenger seat. The woman locked the doors and started the engine without a word. Thanks, I breathed, still trying to process what had just happened. She glanced at me through the rearview mirror. No problem. You looked like you needed out of there. As we pulled away, the street lamp's buzzing faded behind us. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching the dark street recede. My hands trembled, and I swallowed hard, realizing just how close I'd been to something I couldn't even name. The woman didn't ask any questions, and I didn't volunteer any answers. Sometimes, it's better not to know everything right away. For the first time in hours, I let myself breathe. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me, settling into my bones like a warning. I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rain had started again by the time I left the diner. The sky was a low, heavy gray, the kind that promised it would soak through layers of clothing and into your skin before long. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the collar barely able to block the chill creeping up from the wet pavement. The streetlights cast a dull yellow glow over the empty parking lot, their flickering more than usual, as if the bulbs were gasping for life. I checked the time on my phone, 8:47 p.m., and started walking toward my car. Everything about the night felt off, but I couldn't say exactly why. The town was usually quiet at this hour, but not this empty. Even the usual hum of distant traffic or the occasional bark from a dog was missing. There was just the steady drum of rain and my boots hitting the asphalt. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but every time I turned there was nothing. Just the slick road and the darkened storefronts. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave me. I reached my car, a battered old sedan with a cracked windshield and a passenger side door that stuck if you didn't slam it just right. As I unlocked it, I noticed a black pickup truck parked 2 spaces over. It hadn't been there when I arrived. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't tell if anyone was inside, and the rain traced slow rivers down the sides of the truck. My stomach tightened. I didn't know why I felt uneasy about it. Maybe it was the way the headlights were off, but the engine still seemed to be running, or maybe just the sheer silence around it. The usual sounds of a running engine were muted under the rain. I fumbled with my keys, eager to get inside the car and lock the doors. The minute I sat down, I glanced back at the truck again. The driver's window rolled down an inch, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. I stared hard, and after a second, a figure leaned out just enough to speak, voice low and calm but carrying an edge I couldn't place. "Hey, you dropped this earlier," he said, holding up a business card. I blinked, confused. I hadn't noticed dropping anything, especially not outside the diner. I kept my eyes on the figure, trying to place him, but the dim light and rain distorted his face. He was middle-aged, maybe late 40s, with a rough beard and a baseball cap pulled low. "I don't think that's mine," I said cautiously, reaching to take the card but not moving the door handle. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sure. Thought you might want it." His tone was too casual for the situation, like he was testing the waters. I didn't reach out. My hand stayed on the steering wheel as I locked the doors. The click of the locks echoed in the car, louder than I expected. "Okay," I said, still watching him. "Thanks." He made a small nod and rolled the window up slowly. The truck remained silent, the rain dripping from the edges of the windows. I stared at the card in my hand. The name on it was generic enough, Robert Lang, security consultant, but the phone number was local. The address was a rundown office park I'd passed by a dozen times without really noticing. Something about it felt off. I slipped the card into my pocket and started the car, the engine humming to life, warmth flooding the cold interior. As I pulled out of the lot, the truck followed. I spotted it in my rearview mirror, the black shape moving steadily behind me. I took a breath but kept my speed steady, telling myself it was just a coincidence, maybe he was heading the same way. But every turn I made, the truck mirrored me. I tried a few routes I'd taken before, winding through side streets with better lighting or more traffic, but the truck stayed close. My heart pounded harder with every block. I saw the driver's side window down again, but this time no one leaned out. Just a dark figure sitting still, watching. I considered driving to the police station, but it was nearly 10 miles away, and the rain was picking up, making the road slick. I didn't want to get stuck somewhere in the middle of nowhere with this guy possibly following me. In the end, I took the long way home, sticking to well-lit roads and main streets. I called my friend Sarah, hoping just to hear a familiar voice. She answered on the second ring, her tone light and warm. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked. "Not really," I admitted. "I think someone's following me. I'm on my way home, but it's weird. He just won't let up." "Do you want me to come pick you up?" she asked immediately. I hesitated. I didn't want to involve her if it was nothing, but the fear had wrapped itself around me tightly. "Yeah," I said finally. "Could you be there in 20?" I felt a brief relief, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of apprehension. I was still trapped in the car, watching the black truck stay just out of reach, engine idling in the rain. After a few minutes, I spotted headlights approaching from behind. Sarah's car pulled up beside me, its warmth and light a small island in the storm. I unlocked the passenger door and slid in without a word. The truck waited at the stoplight ahead, engine still running but no movement from inside. As we pulled away, Sarah glanced over, her brow furrowed. "That's creepy as hell," she said quietly. We drove the rest of the way in silence, the rain starting to let up as we neared my apartment. I told Sarah everything, the card, the man, the feeling of being watched. She promised to stay with me for the night, and as we climbed the stairs to my door, I felt the weight of the evening still pressing down. The front door locked behind us with a decisive click. We sat in the living room, the quiet between us thick and uneasy. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the black truck idling across the street. But there was nothing. For now. The card still sat on the coffee table, a silent reminder that the night wasn't over, and whatever this was hadn't given up yet.